Publisher's Preface. The classic books in a Bookstream series are unedited and read exactly from the text as originally written by their authors and have been set in their own situations and times. Therefore, some words and phrases may seem out of place or almost offensive today. Fortunately, though, language changes, as do customs and political regimes. And so, we trust that you, the listener, will understand all the language and contents of these books in the sense and setting in which they were first put to paper.
Bram Stoker, The Lair of the White Worm, narrated by Carl Mason. Chapter 1. Adam Salton arrives. Adam Salton sauntered into the Empire Club, Sydney, and found awaiting him a letter from his granduncle. He had first heard from the old gentleman less than a year before, when Richard Salton had claimed kinship, stating that he had been unable to write earlier, as he had found it very difficult to trace his grandnephew's address. Adam was delighted, and replied cordially. He had often heard his father speak of the older branch of the family, with whom his people had long lost touch. Some interesting correspondence had ensued. Adam eagerly opened the letter, which had only just arrived, and conveyed a cordial invitation to stop with his granduncle at Lesser Hill for as long a time as he could spare. Indeed, Richard Salton went on, I am in hopes that you will make your permanent home here. You see, my dear boy, you and I are all that remain of our race, and it is but fitting that you should succeed me when the time comes. In this year of grace 1860, I am close on 80 years of age, and though we have been a long-lived race, the span of life cannot be prolonged beyond reasonable bounds. I am prepared to like you, and to make your home with me as happy as you could wish. So do come at once on receipt of this, and find the welcome I am waiting to give you. I send, in case such may make matters easy for you, a banker's draft for £200. Come soon, so that we may both of us enjoy many happy days together. If you are able to give me the pleasure of seeing you, send me as soon as you can a letter telling me when to expect you. Then when you arrive at Plymouth or Southampton, or whatever port you are bound for, wait on board, and I will meet you at the earliest hour possible. Old Mr. Salton was delighted when Adam's reply arrived, and sent a groom hotfoot to his crony, Sir Nathaniel de Salis, to inform him that his grandnephew was due at Southampton on the 12th of June. Mr. Salton gave instructions to have ready a carriage early on the important day, to start for Stafford, where he would catch the 11:40 a.m. train. He would stay that night with his grandnephew either on the ship, which would be a new experience for him, or, if his guest should prefer it, at a hotel. In either case, they would start in the early morning for home. He had given instructions to his bailiff to send the postilion carriage on to Southampton, to be ready for their journey home, and to arrange for relays of his own horses to be sent on at once. He intended that his grandnephew, who had been all his life in Australia, should see something of rural England on the drive. He had plenty of young horses of his own breeding and breaking, and could depend on a journey memorable to the young man. The luggage would be sent on by rail to Stafford, where one of his carts would meet it. Mr. Salton, during the journey to Southampton, often wondered if his grandnephew was as much excited as he was at the idea of meeting so near a relation for the first time, and it was with an effort that he controlled himself. The endless railway lines and switches round the Southampton docks fired his anxiety afresh. As the train drew up on the dockside, he was getting his hand traps together when the carriage door was wrenched open and a young man jumped in. "How are you, uncle? I recognized you from the photo you sent me. I wanted to meet you as soon as I could, but everything is so strange to me that I didn't quite know what to do. However, here I am. I am glad to see you, sir. I have been dreaming of this happiness for thousands of miles. Now I find that the reality beats all the dreaming." As he spoke, the old man and the young one were heartily wringing each other's hands. The meeting, so auspiciously begun, proceeded well. Adam, seeing that the old man was interested in the novelty of the ship, suggested that he should stay the night on board, and that he would himself be ready to start at any hour and go anywhere that the other suggested. This affectionate willingness to fall in with his own plans quite won the old man's heart. He warmly accepted the invitation, and at once they became not only on terms of affectionate relationship, but almost like old friends. The heart of the old man, which had been empty for so long, found a new delight. The young man found, on landing in the old country, a welcome and a surrounding in full harmony with all his dreams throughout his wanderings and solitude, and the promise of a fresh and adventurous life. It was not long before the old man accepted him to full relationship by calling him by his Christian name. After a long talk on affairs of interest, they retired to the cabin, which the elder was to share. Richard Salton put his hands affectionately on the boy's shoulders. Though Adam was in his 27th year, he was a boy and always would be to his granduncle. "I am so glad to find you as you are, my dear boy. Just such a young man as I had always hoped for as a son, in the days when I still had such hopes. However, that is all past. But thank God there is a new life to begin for both of us. To you must be the larger part, but there is still time for some of it to be shared in common. I have waited till we should have seen each other to enter upon the subject, for I thought it better not to tie up your young life to my old one, till we should have sufficient personal knowledge to justify such a venture. Now I can, so far as I am concerned, enter into it freely, since from the moment my eyes rested on you, I saw my son, as he shall be, God willing, if he chooses such a course himself. Indeed I do, sir, with all my heart." "Thank you, Adam, for that." The old man's eyes filled and his voice trembled. Then after a long silence between them, he went on. "When I heard you were coming, I made my will. It was well that your interest should be protected from that moment on. Here is the deed. Keep it, Adam. All I have shall belong to you, and if love and good wishes or the memory of them can make life sweeter, yours shall be a happy one. Now, my dear boy, let us turn in. We start early in the morning and have a long drive before us. I hope you don't mind driving. I was going to have the old travelling carriage in which my grandfather, your great-granduncle, went to court when William IV was king. It is all right. They built well in those days, and it has been kept in perfect order. But I think I have done better. I have sent the carriage in which I travel myself. The horses are of my own breeding, and relays of them shall take us all the way. I hope you like horses. They have long been one of my greatest interests in life. I love them, sir, and I am happy to say I have many of my own. My father gave me a horse farm for myself when I was 18. I devoted myself to it, and it has gone on. Before I came away, my steward gave me a memorandum that we have in my own place more than 1,000, nearly all good. I am glad, my boy. Another link between us. Just fancy what a delight it will be, sir, to see so much of England, and with you. Thank you again, my boy. I will tell you all about your future home and its surroundings as we go. We shall travel in old-fashioned state, I tell you. My grandfather always drove 4 in hand, and so shall we. Oh, thanks, sir, thanks. May I take the ribbon sometimes? Whenever you choose, Adam. The team is your own. Every horse we use today is to be your own. You are too generous, uncle. Not at all. Only an old man's selfish pleasure. It is not every day that an heir to the old home comes back. And oh, by the way, no, we had better turn in now. I shall tell you the rest in the morning. Chapter 2. The Caswells of Castro Regis. Mr. Salton had all his life been an early riser, and necessarily an early waker. But early as he woke on the next morning, and although there was an excuse for not prolonging sleep, in the constant whir and rattle of the donkey engine winches of the great ship, he met the eyes of Adam fixed on him from his berth. His grandnephew had given him the sofa, occupying the lower berth himself. The old man, despite his great strength and normal activity, was somewhat tired by his long journey of the day before, and the prolonged and exciting interview which followed it. So he was glad to lie still and rest his body, whilst his mind was actively exercised in taking in all he could of his strange surroundings. Adam, too, after his pastoral habit to which he had been bred, woke with the dawn and was ready to enter on the experiences of the new day whenever it might suit his elder companion. It was little wonder, then, that so soon as each realized the other's readiness, they simultaneously jumped up and began to dress. The steward had, by previous instructions, early breakfast prepared, and it was not long before they went down the gangway on shore in search of the carriage. They found Mr. Salton's bailiff looking out for them on the dock, and he brought them at once to where the carriage was waiting in the street. Richard Salton pointed out with pride to his young companion the suitability of the vehicle for every need of travel. To it were harnessed 4 useful horses, with a postilion to each pair. "See," said the old man proudly, "how it has all the luxuries of useful travel, silence and isolation as well as speed. There is nothing to obstruct the view of those travelling, and no one to overhear what they may say. I have used that trap for 1/4 of a century, and I never saw one more suitable for travel. You shall test it shortly. We are going to drive through the heart of England, and as we go by I'll tell you what I was speaking of last night. Our route is to be by Salisbury, Bath, Bristol, Cheltenham, Worcester, Stafford, and so home." Adam remained silent a few minutes, during which he seemed all eyes, for he perpetually ranged the whole circle of the horizon. "Has our journey today, sir," he asked, "any special relation to what you said last night that you wanted to tell me?" "Not directly, but indirectly, everything. Won't you tell me now? I see we cannot be overheard, and if anything strikes you as we go along, just run it in. I shall understand." So old Salton spoke. "To begin at the beginning, Adam, that lecture of yours on the Romans in Britain, a report of which you posted to me, set me thinking. In addition to telling me your tastes, I wrote to you at once and asked you to come home, for it struck me that if you were fond of historical research, as seemed a fact, this was exactly the place for you, in addition to its being the home of your own forebears. If you could learn so much of the British Romans so far away in New South Wales, where there cannot be even a tradition of them, what you might not make of the same amount of study on the very spot. Where we are going is in the real heart of the old kingdom of Mercia, where there are traces of all the various nationalities which made up the conglomerate which became Britain. I rather gathered that you had some more definite, more personal reason for my hurrying. After all, history can keep, except in the making." "Quite right, my boy. I had a reason such as you very wisely guessed. I was anxious for you to be here when a rather important phase of our local history occurred." "What is that, if I may ask, sir?" "Certainly. The principal landowner of our part of the county is on his way home, and there will be a great homecoming, which you may care to see. The fact is, for more than a century, the various owners in the succession here, with the exception of a short time, have lived abroad." "How is that, sir, if I may ask?" "The great house and estate in our part of the world is Castro Regis, the family seat of the Caswell family. The last owner who lived here was Edgar Caswell, grandfather of the man who was coming here, and he was the only one who stayed even a short time. The man's grandfather, also named Edgar, they keep the tradition of the family Christian name, quarrelled with his family and went to live abroad, not keeping up any intercourse, good or bad, with his relatives, although this particular Edgar, as I told you, did visit his family estate. Yet his son was born and lived and died abroad, while his grandson, the latest inheritor, was also born and lived abroad till he was over 30, his present age. This was the second line of absentees. The great estate of Castro Regis has had no knowledge of its owner for 5 generations. Covering more than 120 years, it has been well administered, however, and no tenant or other connected with it has had anything of which to complain. All the same, there has been much natural anxiety to see the new owner, and we are all excited about the event of his coming. Even I am, though I own my own estate, which, though adjacent, is quite apart from Castro Regis. Here, we are now in new ground for you. That is the spire of Salisbury Cathedral, and when we leave that, we shall be getting close to the old Roman county, and you will naturally want your eyes. So we shall shortly have to keep our minds on old Mercia. However, you need not be disappointed. My old friend Sir Nathaniel de Salis, who, like myself, is a freeholder near Castro Regis, his estate, Doon Tower, is over the border of Derbyshire on the Peak, is coming to stay with me for the festivities to welcome Edward Caswell. He is just the sort of man you will like. He is devoted to history and is president of the Mercian Archaeological Society. He knows more of our own part of the country with its history and its people than anyone else. I expect he will have arrived before us, and we three can have a long chat after dinner. He is also our local geologist and natural historian, so you and he will have many interests in common. Amongst other things, he has a special knowledge of the peak and its caverns, and knows all the old legends of prehistoric times. They spent the night at Cheltenham, and on the following morning resumed their journey to Stafford. Adam's eyes were in constant employment, and it was not till Salton declared that they had now entered on the last stage of their journey that he referred to Sir Nathaniel's coming. As the dusk was closing down, they drove on to Lesser Hill, Mr. Salton's house. It was now too dark to see any details of their surroundings. Adam could just see that it was on the top of a hill, not quite so high as that which was covered by the castle, on whose tower flew the flag, and which was all ablaze with moving lights, manifestly used in the preparations for the festivities on the morrow. So Adam deferred his curiosity till daylight. His granduncle was met at the door by a fine old man, who greeted him warmly. "I came over early as you wished. I suppose this is your grandnephew. I am glad to meet you, Mr. Adam Salton. I am Nathaniel de Salis, and your uncle is one of my oldest friends." Adam, from the moment of their eyes meeting, felt as if they were already friends. The meeting was a new note of welcome to those that had already sounded in his ears. The cordiality with which Sir Nathaniel and Adam met made the imparting of information easy. Sir Nathaniel was a clever man of the world, who had travelled much, and within a certain area studied deeply. He was a brilliant conversationalist, as was to be expected from a successful diplomatist, even under unstimulating conditions. But he had been touched and to a certain extent fired by the younger man's evident admiration and willingness to learn from him. Accordingly, the conversation, which began on the most friendly basis, soon warmed to an interest above proof, as the old man spoke of it next day to Richard Salton. He knew already that his old friend wanted his grandnephew to learn all he could of the subject in hand, and so he had, during his journey from the Peak, put his thoughts in sequence for narration and explanation. Accordingly, Adam had only to listen, and he must learn much that he wanted to know. When dinner was over and the servants had withdrawn, leaving the three men at their wine, Sir Nathaniel began. "I gather from your uncle. By the way, I suppose we had better speak of you as uncle and nephew, instead of going into exact relationship? In fact, your uncle is so old and dear a friend that with your permission I shall drop formality with you altogether and speak of you and to you as Adam, as though you were his son." "I should like," answered the young man, "nothing better." The answer warmed the hearts of both the old men, but with the usual avoidance of Englishmen of emotional subjects personal to themselves, they instinctively returned to the previous question. Sir Nathaniel took the lead. "I understand, Adam, that your uncle has posted you regarding the relationships of the Caswell family." "Partly, sir, but I understood that I was to hear minuter details from you, if you would be so good." "I shall be delighted to tell you anything so far as my knowledge goes. Well, the first Caswell in our immediate record is an Edgar, head of the family and owner of the estate, who came into his kingdom just about the time that George III did. He had one son of about 24. There was a violent quarrel between the two. No one of this generation has any idea of the cause. But considering the family characteristics, we may take it for granted that though it was deep and violent, it was on the surface trivial. The result of the quarrel was that the son left the house without a reconciliation or without even telling his father where he was going. He never came back again. A few years after, he died, without having in the meantime exchanged a word or a letter with his father. He married abroad and left one son, who seems to have been brought up in ignorance of all belonging to him. The gulf between them appears to have been unbridgeable, for in time this son married and in turn had a son, but neither joy nor sorrow brought the sundered together. Under such conditions, no rapprochement was to be looked for, and an utter indifference, founded at best on ignorance, took the place of family affection. Even on community of interests, it was only due to the watchfulness of the lawyers that the birth of this new heir was ever made known. He actually spent a few months in the ancestral home. After this, the family interest merely rested on heirship of the estate. As no other children have been born to any of the newer generations in the intervening years, all hopes of heritage are now centered in the grandson of this man. Now, it will be well for you to bear in mind the prevailing characteristics of this race. These were well preserved and unchanging. One and all, they are the same. Cold, selfish, dominant, reckless of consequences in pursuit of their own will. It was not that they did not keep faith, though that was a matter which gave them little concern, but that they took care to think beforehand of what they should do in order to gain their own ends. If they should make a mistake, someone else should bear the burthen of it. This was so perpetually recurrent that it seemed to be a part of a fixed policy. It was no wonder that whatever changes took place, they were always insured in their own possessions. They were absolutely cold and hard by nature. Not one of them, so far as we have any knowledge, was ever known to be touched by the softer sentiments, to swerve from his purpose, or hold his hand in obedience to the dictates of his heart. The pictures and effigies of them all show their adherence to the early Roman type. Their eyes were full, their hair of raven blackness grew thick and close and curly. Their figures were massive and typical of strength. The thick black hair, growing low down on the neck, told of vast physical strength and endurance. But the most remarkable characteristic is the eyes. Black, piercing, almost unendurable. They seem to contain in themselves a remarkable willpower, which there is no gainsaying. It is a power that is partly racial and partly individual, a power impregnated with some mysterious quality, partly hypnotic, partly mesmeric, which seems to take away from eyes that meet them all power of resistance, nay, all power of wishing to resist. With eyes like those, set in that all-commanding face, one would need to be strong indeed to think of resisting the inflexible will that lay behind. You may think, Adam, that all this is imagination on my part, especially as I have never seen any of them. So it is, but imagination based on deep study. I have made use of all I know or can surmise logically regarding this strange race. With such strange, compelling qualities, is it any wonder that there is abroad an idea that in the race there is some demonic possession which tends to a more definite belief that certain individuals have in the past sold themselves to the devil? But I think we had better go to bed now. We have a lot to get through tomorrow, and I want you to have your brain clear and all your susceptibilities fresh. Moreover, I want you to come with me for an early walk, during which we may notice, whilst the matter is fresh in our minds, the peculiar disposition of this place. Not merely your granduncle's estate, but the lie of the country around it. There are many things on which we may seek and perhaps find enlightenment. The more we know at the start, the more things which may come into our view will develop themselves. Chapter 3. Diana's Grove. Curiosity took Adam Salton out of bed in the early morning, but when he had dressed and gone downstairs, he found that early as he was, Sir Nathaniel was ahead of him. The old gentleman was quite prepared for a long walk, and they started at once. Sir Nathaniel, without speaking, led the way to the east, down the hill. When they had descended and risen again, they found themselves on the eastern brink of a steep hill. It was of lesser height than that on which the castle was situated, but it was so placed that it commanded the various hills that crowned the ridge. All along the ridge the rock cropped out, bare and bleak, but broken in rough natural castellation. The form of the ridge was a segment of a circle, with the higher points inland to the west. In the centre rose the castle, on the highest point of all. Between the various rocky excrescences were groups of trees of various sizes and heights, amongst some of which were what in the early morning light looked like ruins. These, whatever they were of massive grey stone, probably limestone, rudely cut, if indeed they were not shaped naturally. The fall of the ground was steep all along the ridge, so steep that here and there both trees and rocks and buildings seemed to overhang the plain far below, through which ran many streams. Sir Nathaniel stopped and looked around, as though to lose nothing of the effect. The sun had climbed the eastern sky and was making all details clear. He pointed with a sweeping gesture, as though calling Adam's attention to the extent of the view. Having done so, he covered the ground more slowly, as though inviting attention to detail. Adam was a willing and attentive pupil, and followed his motions exactly, missing or trying to miss nothing. I have brought you here, Adam, because it seems to me that this is the spot on which to begin our investigations. You have now in front of you almost the whole of the ancient kingdom of Mercia. In fact, we see the whole of it except that furthest part, which is covered by the Welsh marches, and those parts which are hidden from where we stand by the high ground of the immediate west. We can see, theoretically, the whole of the eastern bound of the kingdom, which ran south from the Humber to the Wash. I want you to bear in mind the trend of the ground for some time. Sooner or later, we shall do well to have it in our mind's eye when we are considering the ancient traditions and superstitions and are trying to find the rationale of them. Each legend, each superstition which we receive, will help in the understanding and possible elucidation of the others, and as all such have a local basis, we can come closer to the truth or the probability by knowing the local conditions as we go along. It will help us to bring to our aid such geological truth as we may have between us. For instance, the building materials used in various ages can afford their own lessons to understanding eyes. The very heights and shapes and materials of these hills, nay, even of the wide plain that lies between us and the sea, have in themselves the materials of enlightening books. For instance, sir, said Adam, venturing a question. Well, look at those hills which surround the main one where the site for the castle was wisely chosen on the highest ground. Take the others. There is something ostensible in each of them, and in all probability something unseen and unproved, but to be imagined also. For instance, continued Adam, let us take them seriatim, that to the west, where the trees are, lower down. That was once the location of a Roman temple, possibly founded on a pre-existing judicial one. Its name implies the former, and the grove of ancient oaks suggests the latter. Please explain. The old name translated means Diana's Grove. Then the next one higher than that, but just beyond it, is called Mercy. In all probability a corruption or familiarization of the word Mercia, with a Roman pun included. We learn from early manuscripts that the place was called Villula Misericordiae. It was originally a nunnery founded by Queen Bertha, but done away with by King Penda, the reactionary to paganism after St. Augustine. Then comes your uncle's place, Lesser Hill. Though it is so close to the castle, it is not connected with it. It is a freehold, and so far as we know, of equal age. It has always belonged to your family. Then there only remains the castle. That is all. But its history contains the histories of all the others. In fact, the whole history of early England. Sir Nathaniel, seeing the expectant look on Adam's face, went on. The history of the castle has no beginning so far as we know. The furthest records or surmises or inferences simply accept it as existing. Some of these guesses, let us call them, seem to show that there was some sort of structure there when the Romans came. Therefore, it must have been a place of importance in Druid times, if indeed that was the beginning. Naturally, the Romans accepted it, as they did everything of the kind that was or might be useful. The change is shown or inferred in the name Castro. It was the highest protected ground and so naturally became the most important of their camps. A study of the map will show you that it must have been a most important centre. It both protected the advances already made to the north and helped to dominate the seacoast. It sheltered the western marches, beyond which lay savage Wales and danger. It provided a means of getting to the Severn, round which lay the great Roman roads then coming into existence, and made possible the great waterway to the heart of England, through the Severn and its tributaries. It brought the east and the west together by the swiftest and easiest ways known to those times. And finally, it provided means of descent on London and all the expanse of country watered by the Thames. With such a centre already known and organised, we can easily see that each fresh wave of invasion, the Angles, the Saxons, the Danes and the Normans, found it a desirable possession and so ensured its upholding. In the earlier centuries, it was merely a vantage ground, but when the victorious Romans brought with them the heavy solid fortifications impregnable to the weapons of the time, its commanding position alone ensured its adequate building and equipment. Then it was that the fortified camp of the Caesars developed into the castle of the king. As we are as yet ignorant of the names of the first kings of Mercia, no historian has been able to guess which of them made it his ultimate defense, and I suppose we shall never know. In process of time, as the arts of war developed, it increased in size and strength, and although recorded details are lacking, the history is written not merely in the stone of its building, but is inferred in the changes of structure. Then the sweeping changes which followed the Norman conquest wiped out all lesser records than its own. Today we must accept it as one of the earliest castles of the conquest, probably not later than the time of Henry I. Roman and Norman were both wise in their retention of places of approved strength or utility. So it was that these surrounding heights, already established and to a certain extent proved, were retained. Indeed, such characteristics as already pertained to them were preserved, and today afford to us lessons regarding things which have themselves long since passed away. So much for the fortified heights. But the hollows too have their own story. But how the time passes. We must hurry home or your uncle will wonder what has become of us. He started with long steps towards Lesser Hill, and Adam was soon furtively running in order to keep up with him. Chapter 4. The Lady Arabella Mark. Now there is no hurry, but so soon as you are both ready we shall start, Mr. Salton said when breakfast had begun. I want to take you first to see a remarkable relic of Mercia, and then we'll go to Liverpool, through what is called the Great Vale of Cheshire. You may be disappointed, but take care not to prepare your mind, this to Adam, for anything stupendous or heroic. You would not think the place a vale at all, unless you were told so beforehand, and had confidence in the veracity of the teller. We should get to the landing stage in time to meet the West African, and catch Mr. Caswell as he comes ashore. We want to do him honour, and besides, it will be more pleasant to have the introductions over before we go to his fete at the castle. The carriage was ready, the same as had been used the previous day, but there were different horses, magnificent animals and keen for work. Breakfast was soon over, and they shortly took their places. The postilions had their orders and were quickly on their way at an exhilarating pace. Presently, in obedience to Mr. Salton's signal, the carriage drew up opposite a great heap of stones by the wayside. "Here, Adam," he said, "is something that you of all men should not pass by unnoticed. That heap of stones brings us at once to the dawn of the Anglian kingdom. It was begun more than 1,000 years ago, in the latter part of the 7th century, in memory of a murder. Wulfhere, king of Mercia, nephew of Penda, here murdered his 2 sons for embracing Christianity. As was the custom of the time, each passer-by added a stone to the memorial heap. Penda represented heathen reaction after St. Augustine's mission. Sir Nathaniel can tell you as much as you want about this, and put you, if you wish, on the track of such accurate knowledge as there is." Whilst they were looking at the heap of stones, they noticed that another carriage had drawn up beside them, and the passenger, there was only one, was regarding them curiously. The carriage was an old, heavy travelling one, with arms blazoned on it gorgeously. The men took off their hats as the occupant, a lady, addressed them. "How do you do, Sir Nathaniel? How do you do, Mr. Salton? I hope you have not met with any accident. Look at me." As she spoke, she pointed to where one of the heavy springs was broken across, the broken metal showing bright. Adam spoke up at once. "Oh, that can soon be put right." "Soon? There was no one near who can mend a break like that." "I can." "You?" She looked incredulously at the dapper young gentleman who spoke. "You? Why, it's a workman's job." "All right, I am a workman, though that is not the only sort of work I do. I am an Australian, and as we have to move about fast, we are all trained to farriery and such mechanics as come into travel. I am quite at your service. I hardly know how to thank you for your kindness, of which I gladly avail myself. I don't know what else I can do, as I wish to meet Mr. Caswell of Castro Regis, who arrives home from Africa today. It is a notable homecoming. All the countryside want to do him honour." She looked at the old men and quickly made up her mind as to the identity of the stranger. "You must be Mr. Adam Salton of Lesser Hill. I am Lady Arabella March of Diana's Grove." As she spoke, she turned slightly to Mr. Salton, who took the hint and made a formal introduction. So soon as this was done, Adam took some tools from his uncle's carriage and at once began work on the broken spring. He was an expert workman, and the breach was soon made good. Adam was gathering the tools which he had been using, which, after the manner of all workmen, had been scattered about, when he noticed that several black snakes had crawled out from the heap of stones and were gathering around him. This naturally occupied his mind, and he was not thinking of anything else when he noticed Lady Arabella, who had opened the door of the carriage, slip from it with a quick, gliding motion. She was already among the snakes when he called out to warn her, but there seemed to be no need of warning. The snakes had turned and were wriggling back to the mound as quickly as they could. He laughed to himself behind his teeth as he whispered, "No need to fear there. They seem much more afraid of her than she of them." All the same, he began to beat on the ground with a stick, which was lying close to him, with the instinct of one used to such vermin. In an instant, he was alone beside the mound with Lady Arabella, who appeared quite unconcerned at the incident. Then he took a long look at her, and her dress alone was sufficient to attract attention. She was clad in some kind of soft white stuff, which clung close to her form, showing to the full every movement of her sinuous figure. She wore a close-fitting cap of some fine fur of dazzling white. Coiled round her white throat was a large necklace of emeralds, whose profusion of colour dazzled when the sun shone on them. Her voice was peculiar, very low and sweet, and so soft that the dominant note was of sibilation. Her hands too were peculiar, long, flexible, white, with a strange movement, as of waving gently to and fro. She appeared quite at ease, and after thanking Adam, said that if any of his uncle's party were going to Liverpool, she would be most happy to join forces. Whilst you are staying there, Mr. Salton, you must look on the grounds of Diana's Grove as your own, so that you may come and go just as you do in Lesser Hill. There are some fine views, and not a few natural curiosities, which are sure to interest you if you are a student of natural history, especially of an earlier kind, when the world was younger. The heartiness with which she spoke, and the warmth of her words, not of her manner, which was cold and distant, made him suspicious. In the meantime, both his uncle and Sir Nathaniel had thanked her for the invitation, of which, however, they said they were unable to avail themselves. Adam had a suspicion that, though she answered regretfully, she was in reality relieved. When he had got into the carriage with the two old men and they had driven off, he was not surprised when Sir Nathaniel spoke. "I could not but feel that she was glad to be rid of us. She can play her game better alone." "What is her game?" asked Adam unthinkingly. "All the county knows it, my boy. Caswell is a very rich man. Her husband was rich when she married him, or seemed to be. When he committed suicide, it was found that he had nothing left, and the estate was mortgaged up to the hilt. Her only hope is in a rich marriage. I suppose I need not draw any conclusion. You can do that as well as I can." Adam remained silent nearly all the time they were travelling through the alleged Vale of Cheshire. He thought much during that journey and came to several conclusions, though his lips were unmoved. One of these conclusions was that he would be very careful about paying any attention to Lady Arabella. He was himself a rich man. How rich, not even his uncle had the least idea, and would have been surprised had he known. The remainder of the journey was uneventful, and upon arrival at Liverpool they went aboard the West African, which had just come to the landing stage. There, his uncle introduced himself to Mr. Caswell, and followed this up by introducing Sir Nathaniel and then Adam. The newcomer received them graciously, and said what a pleasure it was to be coming home after so long an absence of his family from their old seat. Adam was pleased at the warmth of the reception, but he could not avoid a feeling of repugnance at the man's face. He was trying hard to overcome this when a diversion was caused by the arrival of Lady Arabella. The diversion was welcome to all. The two sultans and Sir Nathaniel were shocked at Caswell's face. So hard, so ruthless, so selfish, so dominant. God help any, was the common thought, who is under the domination of such a man. Presently, his African servant approached him, and at once their thoughts changed to a larger toleration. Caswell looked indeed a savage, but a cultured savage. In him were traces of the softening civilization of ages, of some of the higher instincts and education of man, no matter how rudimentary these might be. But the face of Ulanga, as his master called him, was unreformed, unsoftened savage, and inherent in it were all the hideous possibilities of a lost, devil-ridden child of the forest and the swamp, the lowest of all created things that could be regarded as in some form ostensibly human. Lady Arabella and Ulanga arrived almost simultaneously, and Adam was surprised to notice what effect their appearance had on each other. The woman seemed as if she could not condescend to exhibit any concern or interest in such a creature. On the other hand, the Negro's bearing was such as in itself to justify her pride. He treated her not merely as a slave treats his master, but as a worshipper would treat a deity. He knelt before her with his hands outstretched and his forehead in the dust. So long as she remained, he did not move. It was only when she went over to Caswell that he relaxed his attitude of devotion and stood by respectfully. Adam spoke to his own man, Davenport, who was standing by, having arrived with the bailiff of Lesser Hill, who had followed Mr. Salton in a pony trap. As he spoke, he pointed to an attentive ship's steward, and presently the two men were conversing. I think we ought to be moving, Mr. Salton said to Adam. I have some things to do in Liverpool, and I am sure that both Mr. Caswell and Lady Arabella would like to get under way for Castro Regis. I too, sir, would like to do something, replied Adam. I want to find out where Ross, the animal merchant, lives. I want to take a small animal home with me, if you don't mind. He is only a little thing, and will be no trouble. Of course not, my boy. What kind of animal is it that you want? A mongoose. A mongoose? What on earth do you want it for? To kill snakes. Good. The old man remembered the mound of stones. No explanation was needed. When Ross heard what was wanted, he asked, Do you want something special, or will an ordinary mongoose do? Well, of course, I want a good one, but I see no need for anything special. It is for ordinary use. I can let you have a choice of ordinary ones. I only asked, because I have in stock a very special one which I got lately from Nepal. He has a record of his own. He killed a king cobra that had been seen in the Rajah's garden. But I don't suppose we have any snakes of the kind in this cold climate. I dare say an ordinary one will do. When Adam got back to the carriage, carefully carrying the box with the mongoose, Sir Nathaniel said, Hello, what have you got there? A mongoose. What for? To kill snakes. Sir Nathaniel laughed. I heard Lady Arabella's invitation to you to come to Diana's Grove. Well, what on earth has that got to do with it? Nothing directly that I know of, but we shall see. Adam waited, and the old man went on. Have you by any chance heard the other name which was given long ago to that place? No, sir. It was called... Look here, this subject wants a lot of talking over. Suppose we wait till we are alone and have lots of time before us. All right, sir. Adam was filled with curiosity. But he thought it better not to hurry matters. All would come in good time. Then the three men returned home, leaving Mr. Caswell to spend the night in Liverpool. The following day, the Lesser Hill party set out for Castro Regis, and for the time, Adam thought no more of Diana's Grove or of what mysteries it had contained, or might still contain. The guests were crowding in, and special places were marked for important people. Adam, seeing so many persons of varied degree, looked round for Lady Arabella, but could not locate her. It was only when he saw the old-fashioned travelling carriage approach, and heard the sound of cheering which went with it, that he realized that Edgar Caswell had arrived. Then, on looking more closely, he saw that Lady Arabella, dressed as he had seen her last, was seated beside him. When the carriage drew up at the great flight of steps, the host jumped down and gave her his hand. It was evident to all that she was the chief guest at the festivities. It was not long before the seats on the dais were filled, while the tenants and guests of lesser importance had occupied all the coigns of vantage not reserved. The order of the day had been carefully arranged by a committee. There were some speeches, happily neither many nor long, and then festivities were suspended till the time for feasting arrived. In the interval, Caswell walked among his guests, speaking to all in a friendly manner and expressing a general welcome. The other guests came down from the dais and followed his example. So there was unceremonious meeting and greeting between gentle and simple. Adam Salton naturally followed with his eyes all that went on within their scope, taking note of all who seemed to afford any interest. He was young and a man and a stranger from a far distance, so on all these accounts he naturally took stock rather of the women than of the men, and of these, those who were young and attractive. There were lots of pretty girls among the crowd, and Adam, who was a handsome young man and well set up, got his full share of admiring glances. These did not concern him much, and he remained unmoved until there came along a group of three, by their dress and bearing of the farmer class. One was a sturdy old man, the other two were good-looking girls, one of a little over 20, the other not quite so old. So soon as Adam's eyes met those of the younger girl, who stood nearest to him, some sort of electricity flashed, that divine spark which begins by recognition and ends in obedience. Men call it love. Both his companions noticed how much Adam was taken by the pretty girl, and spoke of her to him in a way which made his heart warm to them. "Did you notice that party that passed? The old man is Michael Watford, one of the tenants of Mr. Caswell. He occupies Mercy Farm, which Sir Nathaniel pointed out to you today. The girls are his granddaughters. The elder, Lilla, being the only child of his elder son, who died when she was less than a year old. His wife died on the same day. She is a good girl, as good as she is pretty. The other is her first cousin, the daughter of Watford's second son. He went for a soldier when he was just over 20 and was drafted abroad. He was not a good correspondent, though he was a good enough son. A few letters came, and then his father heard from the colonel of his regiment that he had been killed by dacoits in Burma. He heard from the same source that his boy had been married to a Burmese, and that there was a daughter only a year old. Watford had the child brought home, and she grew up beside Lilla. The only thing that they heard of her birth was that her name was Mimi. The two children adored each other, and do to this day. Strange how different they are. Lilla, all fair, like the old Saxon stock from which she is sprung. Mimi, showing a trace of her mother's race. Lilla is as gentle as a dove, but Mimi's black eyes glow whenever she is upset. The only thing that upsets her is when anything happens to injure or threaten or annoy Lilla. Then her eyes glow as do the eyes of a bird when her young are menaced. Chapter 5. The White Worm. Mr. Salton introduced Adam to Mr. Watford and his granddaughters, and they all moved on together. Of course, neighbours in the position of the Watfords knew all about Adam Salton, his relationship, circumstances, and prospects. So it would have been strange indeed if both girls did not dream of possibilities of the future. In agricultural England, eligible men of any class are rare. This particular man was specially eligible, for he did not belong to a class in which barriers of caste were strong. So when it began to be noticed that he walked beside Mimi Watford and seemed to desire her society, all their friends endeavoured to give the promising affair a helping hand. When the gong sounded for the banquet, he went with her into the tent where her grandfather had seats. Mr. Salton and Sir Nathaniel noticed that the young man did not come to claim his appointed place at the dais table, but they understood and made no remark, or indeed did not seem to notice his absence. Lady Arabella sat as before at Edgar Caswell's right hand. She was certainly a striking and unusual woman, and to all it seemed fitting from her rank and personal qualities that she should be the chosen partner of the heir on his first appearance. Of course, nothing was said openly by those of her own class who were present, but words were not necessary when so much could be expressed by nods and smiles. It seemed to be an accepted thing that at last there was to be a mistress of Castro Regis, and that she was present amongst them. There were not lacking some who, whilst admitting all her charm and beauty, placed her in the second rank, Lilla Watford being marked as first. There was sufficient divergence of type, as well as of individual beauty, to allow of fair comment. Lady Arabella represented the aristocratic type, and Lilla that of the commonalty. When the dusk began to thicken, Mr. Salton and Sir Nathaniel walked home. The trap had been sent away early in the day, leaving Adam to follow in his own time. He came in earlier than was expected, and seemed upset about something. Neither of the elders made any comment. They all lit cigarettes, and as dinner time was close at hand, went to their rooms to get ready. Adam had evidently been thinking in the interval. He joined the others in the drawing room, looking ruffled and impatient, a condition of things seen for the first time. The others, with the patience or the experience of age, trusted to time to unfold and explain things. They had not long to wait. After sitting down and standing up several times, Adam suddenly burst out. "That fellow seems to think he owns the earth. Can't he let people alone? He seems to think that he has only to throw his handkerchief to any woman and be her master." This outburst was in itself enlightening. Only thwarted affection in some guise could produce this feeling in an amiable young man. Sir Nathaniel, as an old diplomatist, had a way of understanding, as if by foreknowledge, the true inwardness of things, and asked suddenly, but in a matter-of-fact, indifferent voice, was he after Lilla? Yes, and the fellow didn't lose any time either. Almost as soon as they met, he began to butter her up and tell her how beautiful she was. Why, before he left her side, he had asked himself to tea tomorrow at Mercy Farm. Stupid ass. He might see that the girl isn't his sort. I never saw anything like it. It was just like a hawk and a pigeon. As he spoke, Sir Nathaniel turned and looked at Mr. Salton, a keen look, which implied a full understanding. "Tell us all about it, Adam. There are still a few minutes before dinner, and we shall all have better appetites when we have come to some conclusion on this matter." "There is nothing to tell, sir. That is the worst of it. I am bound to say that there was not a word said that a human being could object to. He was very civil, and all that was proper. Just what a landlord might be to a tenant's daughter. Yet, well, I don't know how it was, but it made my blood boil." "How did the hawk and the pigeon come in?" Sir Nathaniel's voice was soft and soothing. Nothing of contradiction or overdone curiosity in it. A tone eminently suited to win confidence. "I can hardly explain. I can only say that he looked like a hawk and she like a dove. And now that I think of it, that is what they each did look like, and do look like in their normal condition." "That is so," came the soft voice of Sir Nathaniel. Adam went on. "Perhaps that early Roman look of his set me off, but I wanted to protect her. She seemed in danger." "She seems in danger in a way from all you young men. I couldn't help noticing the way that even you looked, as if you wished to absorb her." "I hope both you young men will keep your heads cool," put in Mr. Salton. "You know, Adam, it won't do to have any quarrel between you, especially so soon after his homecoming and your arrival here. We must think of the feelings and happiness of our neighbours, mustn't we?" "I hope so, sir. I assure you that, whatever may happen, or even threaten, I shall obey your wishes, in this as in all things." "Hush," whispered Sir Nathaniel, who heard the servants in the passage bringing dinner. After dinner, over the walnuts and the wine, Sir Nathaniel returned to the subjects of the local legends. "It will perhaps be a less dangerous topic for us to discuss than more recent ones." "All right, sir," said Adam heartily. "I think you may depend on me now with regard to any topic. I can even discuss Mr. Caswell. Indeed, I may meet him tomorrow. He is going, as I said, to call at Mercy Farm at 3 o'clock, but I have an appointment at 2. "I notice," said Mr. Salton, "that you do not lose any time." The two old men once more looked at each other steadily. Then, lest the mood of his listener should change with delay, Sir Nathaniel began at once. "I don't propose to tell you all the legends of Mercia, or even to make a selection of them. It will be better, I think, for our purpose, if we consider a few facts, recorded or unrecorded, about this neighbourhood. I think we might begin with Diana's Grove. It has roots in the different epochs of our history, and each has its special crop of legend. The Druid and the Roman are too far off for matters of detail, but it seems to me the Saxon and the Angles are near enough to yield material for legendary lore. We find that this particular place had another name besides Diana's Grove. This was manifestly of Roman origin, or of Grecian, accepted as Roman. The other is more pregnant of adventure and romance than the Roman name. In Mercian tongue, it was the Lair of the White Worm. This needs a word of explanation at the beginning. In the dawn of the language, the word worm had a somewhat different meaning from that in use today. It was an adaptation of the Anglo-Saxon wyrm, meaning a dragon or snake, or from the Gothic worms, a serpent, or the Icelandic orma, or the German worm. We gather that it conveyed originally an idea of size and power, not as now in the diminutive of both these meanings. Here, legendary history helps us. We have the well-known legend of the Wormwell of Lambton Castle, and that of the Laidley Worm of Spindleston Heugh, near Bamborough. In both these legends, the worm was a monster of vast size and power, a veritable dragon or serpent, such as legend attributes to vast fens or quags, where there was illimitable room for expansion. A glance at a geological map will show that whatever truth there may have been of the actuality of such monsters in the early geologic periods, at least there was plenty of possibility. In England, there were originally vast plains where the plentiful supply of water could gather. The streams were deep and slow, and there were holes of abysmal depth where any kind and size of antediluvian monster could find a habitat. In places which now we can see from our windows were mud holes 100 or more feet deep. Who can tell us when the age of the monsters which flourished in slime came to an end? There must have been places and conditions which made for greater longevity, greater size, greater strength than was usual. Such overlappings may have come down even to our earlier centuries. Nay, are there not now creatures of a vastness of bulk regarded by the generality of men as impossible? Even in our own day, there are seen the traces of animals, if not the animals themselves, of stupendous size, veritable survivals from earlier ages, preserved by some special qualities in their habitats. I remember meeting a distinguished man in India who had the reputation of being a great shikari, who told me that the greatest temptation he had ever had in his life was to shoot a giant snake, which he had come across in the Terai of Upper India. He was on a tiger shooting expedition, and as his elephant was crossing a nula, it squealed. He looked down from his howdah and saw that the elephant had stepped across the body of a snake, which was dragging itself through the jungle. So far as I could see, he said, it must have been 80 or 100 feet in length. Fully 40 or 50 feet was on each side of the track, and though the weight which it dragged had thinned it, it was as thick round as a man's body. I suppose you know that when you are after tiger, it is a point of honor not to shoot at anything else, as life may depend on it. I could easily have spined this monster, but I felt that I must not, so with regret I had to let it go. Just imagine such a monster anywhere in this country, and at once we could get a sort of idea of the worms which possibly did frequent the great morasses which spread round the mouths of many of the great European rivers. I haven't the least doubt, sir, that there may have been such monsters as you have spoken of still existing at a much later period than is generally accepted, replied Adam. Also, if there were such things, that this was the very place for them. I have tried to think over the matter since you pointed out the configuration of the ground, but it seems to me that there is a hiatus somewhere. Are there not mechanical difficulties? In what way? Well, our antique monster must have been mighty heavy, and the distances he had to travel were long and the ways difficult. From where we are now sitting down to the level of the mud holes is a distance of several hundred feet. I am leaving out of consideration altogether any lateral distance. Is it possible that there was a way by which a monster could travel up and down and yet no chance recorder have ever seen him? Of course, we have the legends, but is not some more exact evidence necessary in a scientific investigation? My dear Adam, all you say is perfectly right, and were we starting on such an investigation, we could not do better than follow your reasoning. But my dear boy, you must remember that all this took place thousands of years ago. You must remember, too, that all records of the kind that would help us are lacking. Also, that the places to be considered were desert, so far as human habitation or population are considered. In the vast desolation of such a place as complied with the necessary conditions, there must have been such profusion of natural growth as would bar the progress of men formed as we are. The lair of such a monster would not have been disturbed for hundreds or thousands of years. Moreover, these creatures must have occupied places quite inaccessible to man. A snake who could make himself comfortable in a quagmire 100 feet deep would be protected on the outskirts by such stupendous morasses as now no longer exist, or which, if they exist anywhere at all, can be on very few places on the earth's surface. Far be it from me to say that in more elemental times such things could not have been. The condition belongs to the geologic age, the great birth and growth of the world, when natural forces ran riot, when the struggle for existence was so savage that no vitality which was not founded in a gigantic form could have even a possibility of survival. That such a time existed, we have evidences in geology, but there only. We can never expect proofs such as this age demands. We can only imagine or surmise such things, or such conditions and such forces as overcame them. Chapter 6. Hawk and Pigeon. At breakfast time next morning, Sir Nathaniel and Mr. Salton were seated when Adam came hurriedly into the room. "Any news?" asked his uncle mechanically. "4. "For what?" asked Sir Nathaniel. "Snakes," said Adam, helping himself to a grilled kidney. "4 snakes? I don't understand." "Mongoose," said Adam, and then added explanatorily, "I was out with the mongoose just after 3. "4 snakes in one morning? Why, I didn't know there were so many on the Brow," the local name for the western cliff. "I hope that wasn't the consequence of our talk of last night." "It was, sir, but not directly." "But God bless my soul, you didn't expect to get a snake like the Lambton worm, did you? Why, a mongoose, to tackle a monster like that, if there were one, would have to be bigger than a haystack." "These were ordinary snakes, about as big as a walking stick." "Well, it's pleasant to be rid of them, big or little. That is a good mongoose, I am sure. He'll clear out all such vermin round here," said Mr. Salton. Adam went quietly on with his breakfast. Killing a few snakes in the morning was no new experience to him. He left the room the moment breakfast was finished and went to the study that his uncle had arranged for him. Both Sir Nathaniel and Mr. Salton took it that he wanted to be by himself, so as to avoid any questioning or talk of the visit that he was to make that afternoon. They saw nothing further of him till about half an hour before dinner time. Then he came quietly into the smoking room, where Mr. Salton and Sir Nathaniel were sitting together, ready dressed. "I suppose there is no use waiting. We had better get it over at once," remarked Adam. His uncle, thinking to make things easier for him, said, "Get what over?" There was a sign of shyness about him at this. He stammered a little at first, but his voice became more even as he went on. "My visit to Mercy Farm." Mr. Salton waited eagerly. The old diplomatist simply smiled. "I suppose you both know that I was much interested yesterday in the Watfords." There was no denial or fending off the question. Both the old men smiled acquiescence. Adam went on. "I meant you to see it, both of you. You, uncle, because you are my uncle and the nearest of my own kin. And moreover, you couldn't have been more kind to me or made me more welcome if you had been my own father." Mr. Salton said nothing. He simply held out his hand, and the other took it and held it for a few seconds. "And you, sir, because you have shown me something of the same affection which in my wildest dreams of home I had no right to expect." He stopped for an instant, much moved. Sir Nathaniel answered softly, laying his hand on the youth's shoulder. "You are right, my boy, quite right. That is the proper way to look at it. And I may tell you that we old men, who have no children of our own, feel our hearts growing warm when we hear words like those." Then Adam hurried on, speaking with a rush, as if he wanted to come to the crucial point. Mr. Watford had not come in, but Lilla and Mimi were at home, and they made me feel very welcome. They have all a great regard for my uncle. I am glad of that anyway, for I like them all much. We were having tea when Mr. Caswell came to the door, attended by the Negro. Lilla opened the door herself. The window of the living room at the farm is a large one, and from within you cannot help seeing anyone coming. Mr. Caswell said he had ventured to call as he wished to make the acquaintance of all his tenants in a less formal way and more individually than had been possible to him on the previous day. The girls made him welcome. They are very sweet girls, those, sir. Someone will be very happy some day there with either of them. And that man may be you, Adam, said Mr. Salton heartily. A sad look came over the young man's eyes, and the fire his uncle had seen there died out. Likewise, the timbre left his voice, making it sound lonely. Such might crown my life, but that happiness, I fear, is not for me, or not without pain and loss and woe. Well, it's early days yet, cried Sir Nathaniel heartily. The young man turned on him his eyes, which had now grown excessively sad. Yesterday, a few hours ago, that remark would have given me new hope, new courage. But since then, I have learned too much. The old man, skilled in the human heart, did not attempt to argue in such a matter. Too early to give in, my boy. I am not of a giving-in kind, replied the young man earnestly. But after all, it is wise to realize the truth. And when a man, though he is young, feels as I do, as I have felt ever since yesterday when I first saw Mimi's eyes, his heart jumps. He does not need to learn things. He knows. There was silence in the room, during which the twilight stole on imperceptibly. It was Adam who again broke the silence. Do you know, uncle, if we have any second sight in our family? No, not that I ever heard about. Why? Because, he answered slowly, I have a conviction which seems to answer all the conditions of second sight. And then? Asked the old man, much perturbed. And then, the usual inevitable. What in the Hebrides and other places where the sight is a cult, a belief, is called the doom, the court from which there is no appeal. I have often heard of second sight. We have many Western Scots in Australia, but I have realized more of its true inwardness in an instant of this afternoon than I did in the whole of my life previously. A granite wall stretching up to the very heavens, so high and so dark that the eye of God himself cannot see beyond. Well, if the doom must come, it must. That is all. The voice of Sir Nathaniel broke in, smooth and sweet and grave. Can there not be a fight for it? There can for most things. For most things, yes, but for the doom, no. What a man can do, I shall do. There will be, must be a fight. When and where and how, I know not, but a fight there will be. But after all, what is a man in such a case? Adam, there are 3 of us. Salton looked at his old friend as he spoke, and that old friend's eyes blazed. Aye, 3 of us, he said, and his voice rang. There was again a pause, and Sir Nathaniel endeavoured to get back to less emotional and more neutral ground. Tell us of the rest of the meeting. Remember, we are all pledged to this. It is a fight à l'outrance, and we can afford to throw away or forego no chance. We shall throw away or lose nothing that we can help. We fight to win, and the stake is a life, perhaps more than one. We shall see." Then he went on in a conversational tone, such as he had used when he spoke of the coming to the farm of Edgar Caswell. When Mr. Caswell came in, the Negro went a short distance away and there remained. It gave me the idea that he expected to be called, and intended to remain in sight or within hail. Then Mimi got another cup, and made fresh tea, and we all went on together. "Was there anything uncommon? Were you all quite friendly?" asked Sir Nathaniel quietly. "Quite friendly. There was nothing that I could notice out of the common, except," he went on, with a slight hardening of the voice, "except that he kept his eyes fixed on Lilla, in a way which was quite intolerable to any man who might hold her dear." "Now in what way did he look?" asked Sir Nathaniel. "There was nothing in itself offensive, but no one could help noticing it. You did. Miss Watford herself, who was the victim, and Mr. Caswell, who was the offender, are out of range as witnesses. Was there anyone else who noticed?" "Mimi did. Her face flamed with anger as she saw the look." "What kind of look was it? Over-ardent or too admiring, or what? Was it the look of a lover, or one who fain would be? You understand?" "Yes, sir, I quite understand. Anything of that sort I should of course notice. It would be part of my preparation for keeping my self-control, to which I am pledged." "If it were not amatory, was it threatening? Where was the offence?" Adam smiled kindly at the old man. "It was not amatory. Even if it was, such was to be expected. I should be the last man in the world to object, since I am myself an offender in that respect. Moreover, not only have I been taught to fight fair, but by nature I believe I am just. I would be as tolerant of and as liberal to a rival as I should expect him to be to me. No, the look I mean was nothing of that kind, and so long as it did not lack proper respect, I should not of my own part condescend to notice it. Did you ever study the eyes of a hound? At rest? No. When he is following his instincts, or better still," Adam went on, "the eyes of a bird of prey, when he is following his instincts, not when he is swooping, but merely when he is watching his quarry." "No," said Sir Nathaniel, "I don't know that I ever did. Why, may I ask?" That was the look. Certainly not amatory or anything of that kind. Yet it struck me, more dangerous, if not so deadly, as an actual threatening. Again there was a silence, which Sir Nathaniel broke as he stood up. "I think it would be well if we all thought over this by ourselves. Then we can renew the subject." Chapter 7. Ulanga. Mr. Salton had an appointment for 6 o'clock at Liverpool. When he had driven off, Sir Nathaniel took Adam by the arm. "May I come with you for a while to your study? I want to speak to you privately, without your uncle knowing about it, or even what the subject is. You don't mind, do you? It is not idle curiosity. No, no. It is on the subject to which we are all committed. Is it necessary to keep my uncle in the dark about it? He might be offended." "It is not necessary, but it is advisable. It is for his sake that I asked. My friend is an old man, and it might concern him unduly, even alarm him. I promise you there shall be nothing that could cause him anxiety in our silence, or at which he could take umbrage." "Go on, sir," said Adam simply. "You see, your uncle is now an old man. I know it, for we were boys together. He has led an uneventful and somewhat self-contained life, so that any such condition of things as has now arisen is apt to perplex him from its very strangeness. In fact, any new matter is trying to old people. It has its own disturbances and its own anxieties, and neither of these things are good for lives that should be restful. Your uncle is a strong man, with a very happy and placid nature. Given health and ordinary conditions of life, there is no reason why he should not live to be 100. You and I, therefore, who both love him, though in different ways, should make it our business to protect him from all disturbing influences. I am sure you will agree with me that any labour to this end would be well spent. All right, my boy. I see your answer in your eyes, so we need say no more of that. And now, here, his voice changed. Tell me all that took place at that interview. There are strange things in front of us, how strange we cannot at present even guess. Doubtless, some of the difficult things to understand which lie behind the veil will in time be shown to us, to see and to understand. In the meantime, all we can do is to work patiently, fearlessly, and unselfishly, to an end that we think is right. You had got so far as where Lilla opened the door to Mr. Caswell and the Negro. You also observed that Mimi was disturbed in her mind at the way Mr. Caswell looked at her cousin. Certainly, though disturbed is a poor way of expressing her objection. Can you remember well enough to describe Caswell's eyes, and how Lilla looked, and what Mimi said and did? Also, Ulanga, Caswell's West African servant. I'll do what I can, sir. All the time Mr. Caswell was steering, he kept his eyes fixed and motionless, but not as if he was in a trance. His forehead was wrinkled up, as it is when one is trying to see through or into something. At the best of times his face is not a gentle expression, but when it was screwed up like that, it was almost diabolical. It frightened poor Lilla so that she trembled, and after a bit got so pale that I thought she had fainted. However, she held up and tried to stare back, but in a feeble kind of way. Then Mimi came close and held her hand. That braced her up, and still, never ceasing her return stare, she got colour again and seemed more like herself. Did he stare too? More than ever. The weaker Lilla seemed, the stronger he became, just as if he were feeding on her strength. All at once she turned round, threw up her hands and fell down in a faint. I could not see what else happened just then, for Mimi had thrown herself on her knees beside her and hid her from me. Then there was something like a black shadow between us, and there was the nigger, looking more like a malignant devil than ever. I am not usually a patient man, and the sight of that ugly devil is enough to make one's blood boil. When he saw my face, he seemed to realize danger, immediate danger, and slunk out of the room as noiselessly as if he had been blown out. I learned one thing, however. He is an enemy, if ever a man had one. That still leaves us 3-2, put in Sir Nathaniel. Then Caswell slunk out, much as the nigger had done. When he had gone, Lilla recovered at once. Now, said Sir Nathaniel, anxious to restore peace, have you found out anything yet regarding the Negro? I'm anxious to be posted regarding him. I fear there will be, or may be, grave trouble with him. Yes, sir, I've heard a good deal about him. Of course, it is not official, but hearsay must guide us at first. You know my man Davenport, private secretary, confidential man of business, and general factotum. He is devoted to me and has my full confidence. I asked him to stay on board the West African and have a good look round and find out what he could about Mr. Caswell. Naturally, he was struck with the aboriginal savage. He found one of the ship's stewards, who had been on the regular voyages to South Africa. He knew Ulanga and had made a study of him. He is a man who gets on well with niggers, and they open their hearts to him. It seems that this Ulanga is quite a great person in the nigger world of the African West Coast. He has the two things which men of his own colour respect. He can make them afraid, and he is lavish with money. I don't know whose money, but that does not matter. They are always ready to trumpet his greatness. Evil greatness it is, but neither does that matter. Briefly, this is his history. He was originally a witch finder, about as low an occupation as exists amongst aboriginal savages. Then he got up in the world and became an Obi man, which gives an opportunity to wealth via blackmail. Finally, he reached the highest honor in hellish service. he became a user of voodoo, which seems to be a service of the utmost baseness and cruelty. I was told some of his deeds of cruelty, which is simply sickening. They made me long for an opportunity of helping to drive him back to hell. You might think to look at him that you could measure in some way the extent of his vileness, but it would be a vain hope. Monsters such as he belong to an earlier and more rudimentary stage of barbarism. He is in his way a clever fellow, for a nigger, but is none the less dangerous or the less hateful for that. The men in the ship told me that he was a collector. Some of them had seen his collections. Such collections. All that was potent for evil in bird or beast, or even in fish. Beaks that could break and rend and tear. All the birds represented were of a predatory kind. Even the fishes are those which are born to destroy, to wound, to torture. The collection, I assure you, was an object lesson in human malignity. This being has enough evil in his face to frighten even a strong man. It is little wonder that the sight of it put that poor girl into a dead faint. Nothing more could be done at the moment, so they separated. Adam was up in the early morning and took a smart walk round the brow. As he was passing Diana's Grove, he looked in on the short avenue of trees and noticed the snakes killed on the previous morning by the mongoose. They all lay in a row, straight and rigid, as if they had been placed by hands. Their skins seemed damp and sticky, and they were covered all over with ants and other insects. They looked loathsome, so after a glance, he passed on. A little later, when his steps took him, naturally enough, past the entrance to Mercy Farm, he was passed by the Negro, moving quickly under the trees wherever there was shadow, laid across one extended arm, looking like dirty towels across a rail. He had the horrid-looking snakes. He did not seem to see Adam. No one was to be seen at Mercy, except a few workmen in the farmyard. So, after watching on the chance of seeing Mimi, Adam began to go slowly home. Once more, he was passed on the way. This time it was by Lady Arabella, walking hurriedly and so furiously angry that she did not recognize him, even to the extent of acknowledging his bow. When Adam got back to Lesser Hill, he went to the coach house, where the box with the mongoose was kept, and took it with him, intending to finish at the mound of stone what he had begun the previous morning with regard to the extermination. He found that the snakes were even more easily attacked than on the previous day. No less than 6 were killed in the first half hour. As no more appeared, he took it for granted that the morning's work was over and went towards home. The mongoose had by this time become accustomed to him and was willing to let himself be handled freely. Adam lifted him up and put him on his shoulder and walked on. Presently he saw a lady advancing towards him and recognized Lady Arabella. Hitherto the mongoose had been quiet, like a playful, affectionate kitten. But when the two got close, Adam was horrified to see the mongoose in a state of the wildest fury, with every hair standing on end, jump from his shoulder and run towards Lady Arabella. It looked so furious and so intent on attack that he called a warning. "Look out! Look out! The animal is furious and means to attack." Lady Arabella looked more than ever disdainful and was passing on. The mongoose jumped at her in a furious attack. Adam rushed forward with his stick, the only weapon he had. But just as he got within striking distance, the lady drew out a revolver and shot the animal, breaking his backbone. Not satisfied with this, she poured shot after shot into him till the magazine was exhausted. There was no coolness or hauteur about her now. She seemed more furious even than the animal, her face transformed with hate, and as determined to kill as he had appeared to be. Adam, not knowing exactly what to do, lifted his hat in apology and hurried on to Lesser Hill. Chapter 8. Survivals. At breakfast, Sir Nathaniel noticed that Adam was put out about something, but he said nothing. The lesson of silence is better remembered in age than in youth. When they were both in the study, where Sir Nathaniel followed him, Adam at once began to tell his companion of what had happened. Sir Nathaniel looked graver and graver as the narration proceeded, and when Adam had stopped, he remained silent for several minutes before speaking. "This is very grave. I have not formed any opinion yet, but it seems to me at first impression that this is worse than anything I had expected." "Why, sir," said Adam, "is the killing of a mongoose, no matter by whom, so serious a thing as all that?" His companion smoked on quietly for quite another few minutes before he spoke. "When I have properly thought it over, I may moderate my opinion, but in the meantime it seems to me that there is something dreadful behind all this, something that may affect all our lives, that may mean the issue of life or death to any of us." Adam sat up quickly. "Do tell me, sir, what is in your mind, if, of course, you have no objection, or do not think it better to withhold it." "I have no objection, Adam. In fact, if I had, I should have to overcome it. I fear there can be no more reserved thoughts between us. Indeed, sir, that sounds serious, worse than serious." "Adam, I greatly fear that the time has come for us, for you and me, at all events, to speak out plainly to one another. Does not there seem something very mysterious about this?" "I have thought so, sir, all along. The only difficulty one has is what one is to think and where to begin. Let us begin with what you have told me. First, take the conduct of the mongoose. He was quiet, even friendly and affectionate with you. He only attacked the snakes, which is, after all, his business in life. That is so. Then we must try to find some reason why he attacked Lady Arabella. May it not be that a mongoose may have merely the instinct to attack, that nature does not allow or provide him with the fine reasoning powers to discriminate who he is to attack? Of course, that may be so. But on the other hand, should we not satisfy ourselves why he does wish to attack anything? If for centuries this particular animal is known to attack only one kind of other animal, are we not justified in assuming that when one of them attacks a hitherto unclassed animal, he recognizes in that animal some quality which it has in common with the hereditary enemy? That is a good argument, sir, Adam went on, but a dangerous one. If we followed it out, it would lead us to believe that Lady Arabella is a snake. We must be sure before going to such an end that there is no point as yet unconsidered which would account for the unknown thing which puzzles us. In what way? Well, suppose the instinct works on some physical basis, for instance. Smell, if there were anything in recent juxtaposition to the attacked, which would carry the scent. Surely that would supply the missing course. Of course, Adam spoke with conviction. Now, from what you tell me, the Negro had just come from the direction of Diana's Grove, carrying the dead snakes, which the mongoose had killed the previous morning. Might not the scent have been carried that way? Of course it might, and probably was. I never thought of that. Is there any possible way of guessing approximately how long a scent will remain? You see, this is a natural scent, and may derive from a place where it has been effective for thousands of years. Then does a scent of any kind carry with it any form or quality of another kind, either good or evil? I ask you because one ancient name of the house lived in by the lady who was attacked by the mongoose was the Lair of the White Worm. If any of these things be so, our difficulties have multiplied indefinitely. They may even change in kind. We may get into moral entanglements before we know it. We may be in the midst of a struggle between good and evil. Sir Nathaniel smiled gravely. With regard to the first question, so far as I know, there are no fixed periods for which a scent may be active. I think we may take it that that period does not run into thousands of years. As to whether any moral change accompanies a physical one, I can only say that I have met no proof of the fact. At the same time, we must remember that good and evil are terms so wide as to take in the whole scheme of creation and all that is implied by them and by their mutual action and reaction. Generally, I would say that in the scheme of a first cause, anything is possible, so long as the inherent forces or tendencies of any one thing are veiled from us. We must expect mystery. There is one other question on which I should like to ask your opinion. Suppose that there are any permanent forces appertaining to the past, what we may call survivals. Do these belong to good as well as to evil? For instance, if the scent of the primeval monster can so remain in proportion to the original strength, can the same be true of things of good import? Sir Nathaniel thought for a while before he answered. We must be careful not to confuse the physical and the moral. I can see that already you have switched on the moral entirely, so perhaps we had better follow it up first. On the side of the moral, we have certain justification for belief in the utterances of revealed religion. For instance, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, is altogether for good. We have nothing of a similar kind on the side of evil. But if we accept this dictum, we need have no more fear of mysteries. These become thenceforth merely obstacles. Adam suddenly changed to another phase of the subject. And now, sir, may I turn for a few minutes to purely practical things, or rather to matters of historical fact? Sir Nathaniel bowed acquiescence. We have already spoken of the history, so far as it is known, of some of the places around us. Castro Regis, Diana's Grove, and the Lair of the White Worm. I would like to ask if there is anything not necessarily of evil import about any of the places. Which? Asked Sir Nathaniel shrewdly. Well, for instance, this house and Mercy Farm. Here we turn, said Nathaniel, to the other side, the light side of things. Let us take Mercy Farm first. When Augustine was sent by Pope Gregory to Christianize England in the time of the Romans, he was received and protected by Ethelbert, King of Kent, whose wife, daughter of Charibert, King of Paris, was a Christian and did much for Augustine. She founded a nunnery in memory of Columbia, which was named Sedis Misericordio, the House of Mercy, and as the region was Mercian, the two names became involved. As Columbia is the Latin for dove, the dove became a sort of signification of the nunnery. She seized on the idea and made the newly founded nunnery a house of doves. Someone sent her a freshly discovered dove, a sort of carrier, but which had in the white feathers of its head and neck the form of a religious cowl. The nunnery flourished for more than a century, when in the time of Penda, who was the reactionary of heathendom, it fell into decay. In the meantime, the doves, protected by religious feeling, had increased mightily, and were known in all Catholic communities. When King Offa ruled in Mercia about 150 years later, he restored Christianity, and under its protection the nunnery of St. Columbia was restored and its doves flourished again. In process of time, this religious house again fell into desuetude, but before it disappeared, it had achieved a great name for good works, and in especial for the piety of its members. If deeds and prayers and hopes and earnest thinking leave anywhere any moral effect, Mercy Farm and all around it have almost the right to be considered holy ground. Thank you, sir, Adam said earnestly, and was silent. Sir Nathaniel understood. After lunch that day, Adam casually asked Sir Nathaniel to come for a walk with him. The keen-witted old diplomatist guessed that there must be some motive behind the suggestion, and he at once agreed. As soon as they were free from observation, Adam began. I am afraid, sir, that there is more going on in this neighbourhood than most people imagine. I was out this morning, and on the edge of the small wood, I came upon the body of a child by the roadside. At first, I thought she was dead, and while examining her, I noticed on her neck some marks that looked like those of teeth. Some wild dog, perhaps? Put in Sir Nathaniel. Possibly, sir, though I think not. But listen to the rest of my news. I glanced around and, to my surprise, I noticed something white moving among the trees. I placed the child down carefully and followed, but I could not find any further traces. So I returned to the child and resumed my examination, and to my delight, I discovered that she was still alive. I chafed her hands, and gradually she revived. But to my disappointment, she remembered nothing, except that something had crept up quietly from behind and had gripped her round the throat. Then, apparently, she fainted. Gripped her round the throat? Then it cannot have been a dog. No, sir. That is my difficulty, and explains why I brought you out here, where we cannot possibly be overheard. You have noticed, of course, the peculiar sinuous way in which Lady Arabella moves. Well, I feel certain that the white thing that I saw in the wood was the mistress of Diana's Grove. Good boy. Be careful what you say. Yes, sir. I fully realize the gravity of my accusation, but I feel convinced that the marks on the child's throat were human and made by a woman. Adam's companion remained silent for some time, deep in thought. Adam, my boy, he said at last, this matter appears to me to be far more serious even than you think. It forces me to break confidence with my old friend, your uncle. But in order to spare him, I must do so. For some time now, things have been happening in this district that have been worrying him dreadfully. Several people have disappeared without leaving the slightest trace. A dead child was found by the roadside with no visible or ascertainable cause of death. Sheep and other animals have been found in the fields, bleeding from open wounds. There have been other matters, many of them apparently trivial in themselves. Some sinister influence has been at work, and I admit that I have suspected Lady Arabella. That is why I questioned you so closely about the mongoose and its strange attack upon Lady Arabella. You will think it strange that I should suspect the mistress of Diana's Grove, a beautiful woman of aristocratic birth? Let me explain. The family seat is near my own place, Doom Tower, and at one time I knew the family well. When still a young girl, Lady Arabella wandered into a small wood near her home and did not return. She was found unconscious and in a high fever. The doctor said that she had received a poisonous bite, and the girl being at a delicate and critical age, the result was serious. So much so that she was not expected to recover. A great London physician came down, but could do nothing. Indeed, he said that the girl would not survive the night. All hope had been abandoned when, to everyone's surprise, Lady Arabella made a sudden and startling recovery. Within a couple of days, she was going about as usual. But to the horror of her people, she developed a terrible craving for cruelty, maiming and injuring birds and small animals, even killing them. This was put down to a nervous disturbance due to her age, and it was hoped that her marriage to Captain March would put this right. However, it was not a happy marriage, and eventually her husband was found shot through the head. I have always suspected suicide, though no pistol was found near the body. He may have discovered something, God knows what, so possibly Lady Arabella may herself have killed him. Putting together many small matters that have come to my knowledge, I have come to the conclusion that the foul white worm obtained control of her body just as her soul was leaving its earthly tenement. That will explain the sudden revival of energy, the strange and inexplicable craving for maiming and killing, as well as many other matters which I need not trouble you now, Adam. As I said just now, God alone knows what poor Captain March discovered. It must have been something too ghastly for human endurance, if my theory is correct that the once beautiful human body of Lady Arabella is under the control of this ghastly white worm. Adam nodded. But what can we do, sir? It seems a most difficult problem. We can do nothing, my boy. That is the important part of it. It would be impossible to take action. All we can do is to keep careful watch, especially as regards Lady Arabella, and be ready to act promptly and decisively if the opportunity occurs. Adam agreed, and the two men returned to Lesser Hill. Chapter 9. Smelling Death. Adam Salton, though he talked little, did not let the grass grow under his feet in any matter which he had undertaken, or in which he was interested. He had agreed with Sir Nathaniel that they should not do anything with regard to the mystery of Lady Arabella's fear of the mongoose, but he steadily pursued his course in being prepared to act whenever the opportunity might come. He was in his own mind perpetually casting about for information or clues which might lead to possible lines of action. Baffled by the killing of the mongoose, he looked around for another line to follow. He was fascinated by the idea of there being a mysterious link between the woman and the animal, but he was already preparing a second string to his bow. His new idea was to use the faculties of Ulanga, so far as he could, in the service of discovery. His first move was to send Davenport to Liverpool to try to find the steward of the West African, who had told him about Ulanga, and if possible, secure any further information, and then try to induce, by bribery or other means, the nigger to come to the brow. So soon as he himself could have speech of the voodoo man, he would be able to learn from him something useful. Davenport was successful in his missions, for he had to get another mongoose, and he was able to tell Adam that he had seen the steward, who told him much that he wanted to know, and had also arranged for Ulanga to come to Lesser Hill the following day. At this point, Adam saw his way sufficiently clear to admit Davenport to some extent into his confidence. He had come to the conclusion that it would be better, certainly at first, not himself to appear in the matter, with which Davenport was fully competent to deal. It would be time for himself to take a personal part when matters had advanced a little further. If what the nigger said was in any wise true, the man had a rare gift which might be useful in the quest they were after. He could, as it were, smell death. If anyone was dead, if anyone had died, or if a place had been used in connection with death, he seemed to know the broad fact by intuition. Adam made up his mind that to test this faculty with regard to several places would be his first task. Naturally, he was anxious, and the time passed slowly. The only comfort was the arrival the next morning of a strong packing case, locked from Ross, the key being in the custody of Davenport. In the case were two smaller boxes, both locked. One of them contained a mongoose to replace that killed by Lady Arabella. The other was the special mongoose which had already killed the king cobra in Nepal. When both the animals had been safely put under lock and key, he felt that he might breathe more freely. No one was allowed to know the secret of their existence in the house, except himself and Davenport. He arranged that Davenport should take Ulanga round the neighbourhood for a walk, stopping at each of the places which he designated. Having gone all along the brow, he was to return the same way and induce him to touch on the same subjects in talking with Adam, who was to meet with them as if by chance at the farthest part, that beyond Mercy Farm. The incidents of the day proved much as Adam expected. At Mercy Farm, at Diana's Grove, at Castro Regis, and a few other spots, the Negro stopped and, opening his wide nostrils as if to sniff boldly, said that he smelled death. It was not always in the same form. At Mercy Farm, he said there were many small deaths. At Diana's Grove, his bearing was different. There was a distinct sense of enjoyment about him, especially when he spoke of many great deaths. Here, too, he sniffed in a strange way, like a bloodhound at check, and looked puzzled. He said no word in either praise or disparagement, but in the centre of the grove, where hidden amongst ancient oak stumps was a block of granite, slightly hollowed on the top. He bent low and placed his forehead on the ground. This was the only place where he showed distinct reverence. At the castle, though he spoke of much death, he showed no sign of respect. There was evidently something about Diana's Grove which both interested and baffled him. Before leaving, he moved all over the place, unsatisfied, and in one spot, close to the edge of the brow, where there was a deep hollow, he appeared to be afraid. After returning several times to this place, he suddenly turned and ran in a panic of fear to the higher ground, crossing as he did so the outcropping rock. Then he seemed to breathe more freely and recovered some of his jaunty impudence. All this seemed to satisfy Adam's expectations. He went back to Lesser Hill with a serene and settled calm upon him. Sir Nathaniel followed him into his study. "By the way, I forgot to ask you details about one thing. When that extraordinary staring episode of Mr. Caswell went on, how did Lilla take it? How did she bear herself?" "She looked frightened and trembled, just as I have seen a pigeon with a hawk or a bird with a serpent." "Thanks. It is just as I expected. There have been circumstances in the Caswell family which lead one to believe that they have had from the earliest times some extraordinary mesmeric or hypnotic faculty. Indeed, a skilled eye could read so much in their physiognomy. That shot of yours, whether by instinct or intention, of the hawk and the pigeon was peculiarly apposite. I think we may settle on that as a fixed trait to be accepted throughout our investigation." When dusk had fallen, Adam took the new mongoose, not the one from Nepal, and carrying the box slung over his shoulder, strolled towards Diana's Grove. Close to the gateway, he met Lady Arabella, clad as usual in tightly fitting white, which showed off her slim figure. To his intense astonishment, the mongoose allowed her to pet him, take him up in her arms and fondle him. As she was going in his direction, they walked on together. Round the roadway between the entrances of Diana's Grove and Lesser Hill were many trees, with not much foliage except at the top. In the dusk, this place was shadowy, and the view was hampered by the clustering trunks. In the uncertain, tremulous light which fell through the treetops, it was hard to distinguish anything clearly, and at last, somehow, he lost sight of her altogether and turned back on his track to find her. Presently, he came across her close to her own gate. She was leaning over the paling of split oak branches, which formed the paling of the avenue. He could not see the mongoose, so he asked her where it had gone. "He slipped out of my arms while I was petting him," she answered, "and disappeared under the hedges. They found him at a place where the avenue widened so as to let carriages pass each other." The little creature seemed quite changed. He had been ebulliently active. Now he was dull and spiritless, seemed to be dazed. He allowed himself to be lifted by either of the pair, but when he was alone with Lady Arabella, he kept looking round him in a strange way, as though trying to escape. When they had come out on the roadway, Adam held the mongoose tight to him, and lifting his hat to his companion, moved quickly towards Lesser Hill. He and Lady Arabella lost sight of each other in the thickening gloom. When Adam got home, he put the mongoose in his box and locked the door of the room. The other mongoose, the one from Nepal, was safely locked in his own box, but he lay quiet and did not stir. When he got to his study, Sir Nathaniel came in, shutting the door behind him. "I have come," he said, "while we have an opportunity of being alone, to tell you something of the Caswell family, which I think will interest you. There is, or used to be, a belief in this part of the world that the Caswell family had some strange power of making the wills of other persons subservient to their own. There are many allusions to the subject in memoirs and other unimportant works, but I only know of one where the subject is spoken of definitely. It is Mercia and its Worthies, written by Ezra Toms more than 100 years ago. The author goes into the question of the close association of the then Edgar Caswell with Mesmer in Paris. He speaks of Caswell being a pupil and the fellow worker of Mesmer, and states that though when the latter left France, he took away with him a vast quantity of philosophical and electrical instruments, he was never known to use them again. He once made it known to a friend that he had given them to his old pupil. The term he used was odd, for it was bequeathed, but no such bequest of Mesmer was ever made known. At any rate, the instruments were missing and never turned up. A servant came into the room to tell Adam that there was some strange noise coming from the locked room into which he had gone when he came in. He hurried off to the place at once, Sir Nathaniel going with him. Having locked the door behind them, Adam opened the packing case where the boxes of the 2 mongooses were locked up. There was no sound from one of them, but from the other, a queer, restless struggling. Having opened both boxes, he found that the noise was from the Nepal animal, which, however, became quiet at once. In the other box, the new mongoose lay dead, with every appearance of having been strangled. Chapter 10. The Kite. On the following day, a little after 4 o'clock, Adam set out for Mercy. He was home just as the clocks were striking 6. He was pale and upset, but otherwise looked strong and alert. The old man summed up his appearance and manner thus: "Braced up for battle." "Now," said Sir Nathaniel, and settled down to listen, looking at Adam steadily and listening attentively that he might miss nothing, even the inflection of a word. "I found Lilla and Mimi at home. Watford had been detained by business on the farm. Miss Watford received me as kindly as before. Mimi too seemed glad to see me. Mr. Caswell came so soon after I arrived that he or someone on his behalf must have been watching for me. He was followed closely by the Negro, who was puffing hard as if he had been running, so it was probably he who watched. Mr. Caswell was very cool and collected, but there was a more than usually iron look about his face that I did not like. However, we got on very well. He talked pleasantly on all sorts of questions. The nigger waited a while and then disappeared as on the other occasion. Mr. Caswell's eyes were, as usual, fixed on Lilla. True, they seemed to be very deep and earnest, but there was no offence in them. Had it not been for the drawing down of the brows and the stern set of the jaws, I should not at first have noticed anything. But the stare, when presently it began, increased in intensity. I could see that Lilla began to suffer from nervousness, as on the first occasion, but she carried herself bravely. However, the more nervous she grew, the harder Mr. Caswell stared. It was evident to me that he had come prepared for some sort of mesmeric or hypnotic battle. After a while he began to throw glances round him, and then raised his hand, without letting either Lilla or Mimi see the action. It was evidently intended to give some sign to the Negro, for he came in his usual stealthy way quietly in by the hall door, which was open. Then Mr. Caswell's efforts at steering became intensified, and poor Lilla's nervousness grew greater. Mimi, seeing that her cousin was distressed, came close to her, as if to comfort or strengthen her with the consciousness of her presence. This evidently made a difficulty for Mr. Caswell, for his efforts, without appearing to get feebler, seemed less effective. This continued for a little while, to the gain of both Lilla and Mimi. Then there was a diversion. Without word or apology, the door opened, and Lady Arabella March entered the room. I had seen her come in through the window. Without a word, she crossed the room and stood beside Mr. Caswell. It really was very like a fight of a peculiar kind, and the longer it was sustained, the more earnest, the fiercer it grew. That combination of forces, the overlord, the white woman, and the black man, would have cost some, probably all of them, their lives in the southern states of America. To us it was simply horrible. But all that you can understand. This time, to go on in sporting phrase, it was understood by all to be a fight to a finish, and the mixed group did not slacken a moment or relax their efforts. On Lilla, the strain began to tell disastrously. She grew pale, a patchy pallor, which meant that her nerves were out of order. She trembled like an aspen, and though she struggled bravely, I noticed that her legs would hardly support her. A dozen times she seemed about to collapse in a faint, but each time on catching sight of Mimi's eyes, she made a fresh struggle and pulled through. By now Mr. Caswell's face had lost its appearance of passivity. His eyes glowed with a fiery light. He was still the old Roman in inflexibility of purpose, but grafted onto the Roman was a new berserker fury. His companions in the baleful work seemed to have taken on something of his feeling. Lady Arabella looked like a soulless, pitiless being, not a human, unless it revived old legends of transformed human beings who had lost their humanity in some transformation, or in the sweep of natural savagery. As for the Negro, well, I can only say that it was solely due to the self-restraint which you impressed on me that I did not wipe him out as he stood, without warning, without fair play, without a single one of the graces of life and death. Lilla was silent in their helpless concentration of deadly fear. Mimi was all resolve and self-forgetfulness, so intent on the soul struggle in which she was engaged that there was no possibility of any other thought. As for myself, the bonds of will which held me inactive seemed like bands of steel which numbed all my faculties, except sight and hearing. We seemed fixed in an impasse. Something must happen, though the power of guessing was inactive. As in a dream, I saw Mimi's hand move restlessly, as if groping for something. Mechanically, it touched that of Lilla, and in that instant, she was transformed. It was as if youth and strength entered afresh into something already dead to sensibility and intention. As if by inspiration, she grasped the other's hand with a force which blenched the knuckles. Her face suddenly flamed, as if some divine light shone through it. Her form expanded till it stood out majestically. Lifting her right hand, she stepped forward towards Caswell, and with a bold sweep of her arm, seemed to drive some strange force towards him. Again and again was the gesture repeated, the man falling back from her at each movement. Towards the door he retreated, she following. There was a sound, as of the cooing sob of doves, which seemed to multiply and intensify with each second. The sound from the unseen source rose and rose as he retreated, till finally it swelled out in a triumphant peal, as she, with a fierce sweep of her arm, seemed to hurl something at her foe, and he, moving his hands blindly before his face, appeared to be swept through the doorway and out into the open sunlight. All at once, my own faculties were fully restored. I could see and hear everything, and be fully conscious of what was going on. Even the figures of the baleful group were there, though dimly seen as through a veil, a shadowy veil. I saw Lilla sink down in a swoon, and Mimi throw up her arms in a gesture of triumph. As I saw her through the great window, the sunshine flooded the landscape, which, however, was momentarily becoming eclipsed by an onrush of a myriad birds. By the next morning, daylight showed the actual danger which threatened. From every part of the eastern counties, reports were received concerning the enormous immigration of birds. Experts were sending on their own account, on behalf of learned societies, and through local and imperial governing bodies, reports dealing with the matter and suggesting remedies. The reports closer to home were even more disturbing. All day long it would seem that the birds were coming thicker from all quarters. Doubtless many were going as well as coming, but the mass seemed never to get less. Each bird seemed to sound some note of fear or anger or seeking, and the whirring of wings never ceased nor lessened. The air was full of a muttered throb. No window or barrier could shut out the sound, till the ears of any listener became dulled by the ceaseless murmur. So monotonous it was, so cheerless, so disheartening, so melancholy, that all longed but in vain for any variety, no matter how terrible it might be. The second morning, the reports from all the districts round were more alarming than ever. Farmers began to dread the coming of winter as they saw the dwindling of the timely fruitfulness of the earth. And as yet it was only a warning of evil, not the evil accomplished. The ground began to look bare whenever some passing sound temporarily frightened the birds. Edgar Caswell tortured his brain for a long time unavailingly, to think of some means of getting rid of what he, as well as his neighbours, had come to regard as a plague of birds. At last, he recalled a circumstance which promised the solution of the difficulty. The experience was of some years ago in China, far up country, towards the headwaters of the Yangtze, where the smaller tributaries spread out in a sort of natural irrigation scheme to supply the wilderness of paddy fields. It was at the time of the ripening rice, and the myriad of birds which came to feed on the coming crop was a serious menace not only to the district but to the country at large. The farmers, who were more or less afflicted with the same trouble every season, knew how to deal with it. They made a vast kite, which they caused to be flown over the centre spot of the incursion. The kite was shaped like a great hawk, and the moment it rose into the air, the birds began to cower and seek protection, and then to disappear. So long as that kite was flying overhead, the birds lay low and the crop was saved. Accordingly, Caswell ordered his men to construct an immense kite, adhering as well as they could to the lines of a hawk. Then he and his men, with a sufficiency of cord, began to fly it overhead. The experience of China was repeated. The moment the kite rose, the birds hid or sought shelter. The following morning, the kite was still flying high. No bird was to be seen as far as the eye could reach from Castro, Regis. But there followed in turn what proved even a worse evil. All the birds were cowed, their sound stopped. Neither song nor chirp was heard. Silence seemed to have taken the place of the normal voices of bird life. But that was not all. The silence spread to all animals. The fear and restraint which brooded amongst the denizens of the air began to affect all life. Not only did the birds cease song or chirp, but the lowing of the cattle ceased in the fields, and the varied sounds of life died away. In place of these things was only a soundless gloom, more dreadful, more disheartening, more soul-killing than any concourse of sounds, no matter how full of fear and dread. Pious individuals put up constant prayers for relief from the intolerable solitude. After a little while, there were signs of universal depression, which those who ran might read. One and all the faces of men and women seemed bereft of vitality, of interest, of thought, and most of all, of hope. Men seemed to have lost the power of expression of their thoughts. The soundless air seemed to have the same effect as the universal darkness when men gnawed their tongues with pain. From this infliction of silence there was no relief. Everything was affected. Gloom was the predominant note. Joy appeared to have passed away as a factor of life, and this creative impulse had nothing to take its place. That giant spot in high air was a plague of evil influence. It seemed like a new misanthropic belief which had fallen on human beings, carrying with it the negation of all hope. After a few days, men began to grow desperate. Their very words as well as their senses seemed to be in chains. Edgar Caswell again tortured his brain to find any antidote or palliative of this greater evil than before. He would gladly have destroyed the kite or caused its flying to cease. But the instant it was pulled down, the birds rose up in even greater numbers. All those who depended in any way on agriculture sent pitiful protests to Castro, Regis. It was strange indeed what influence that weird kite seemed to exercise. Even human beings were affected by it, as if both it and they were realities. As for the people at Mercy Farm, it was like a taste of actual death. Lilla felt it most. If she had been indeed a real dove, with a real kite hanging over her in the air, she could not have been more frightened or more affected by the terror this created. Of course, some of those already drawn into the vortex noticed the effect on individuals. Those who were interested took care to compare their information. Strangely enough, as it seemed to the others, the person who took the ghastly silence least to heart was the Negro. By nature, he was not sensitive to or afflicted by nerves. This alone would not have produced the seeming indifference, so they set their minds to discover the real cause. Adam came quickly to the conclusion that there was for him some compensation that the others did not share, and he soon believed that that compensation was in one form or another the enjoyment of the sufferings of others. Thus the black had never a failing source of amusement. Lady Arabella's cold nature rendered her immune to anything in the way of pain or trouble concerning others. Edgar Caswell was far too haughty a person and too stern of nature to concern himself about poor or helpless people, much less the lower order of mere animals. Mr. Watford, Mr. Salton, and Sir Nathaniel were all concerned in the issue, partly from kindness of heart, for none of them could see suffering, even of wild birds, unmoved, and partly on account of their property, which had to be protected, or ruin would stare them in the face before long. Lilla suffered acutely. As time went on, her face became pinched, and her eyes dull with watching and crying. Mimi suffered too on account of her cousin's suffering. But as she could do nothing, she resolutely made up her mind to self-restraint and patience. Adam's frequent visits comforted her. Chapter 11. Mesmer's Chest. After a couple of weeks had passed, the kite seemed to give Edgar Caswell a new zest for life. He was never tired of looking at its movements. He had a comfortable armchair put out on the tower, wherein he sat sometimes all day long, watching as though the kite was a new toy, and he a child lately come into possession of it. He did not seem to have lost interest in Lilla, for he still paid an occasional visit at Mercy Farm. Indeed, his feelings towards her, whatever it had been at first, had now so far changed that it had become a distinct affection of a purely animal kind. Indeed, it seemed as though the man's nature had become corrupted, and that all the baser and more selfish and more reckless qualities had become more conspicuous. There was not so much sternness apparent in his nature, because there was less self-restraint. Determination had become indifference. The visible change in Edgar was that he grew morbid, sad, silent. The neighbors thought he was going mad. He became absorbed in the kite and watched it not only by day but often all night long. It became an obsession to him. Caswell took a personal interest in the keeping of the great kite flying. He had a vast coil of cord efficient for the purpose, which worked on a roller fixed on the parapet of the tower. There was a winch for the pulling in of the slack, the outgoing line being controlled by a racket. There was invariably one man at least, day and night, on the tower to attend to it. At such an elevation there was always a strong wind, and at times the kite rose to an enormous height, as well as travelling for great distances laterally. In fact, the kite became, in a short time, one of the curiosities of Castro Regis and all around it. Edgar began to attribute to it, in his own mind, almost human qualities. It became to him a separate entity, with a mind and a soul of its own. Being idle-handed all day, he began to apply to what he considered the service of the kite some of his spare time, and found a new pleasure, a new object in life, in the old schoolboy game of sending up runners to the kite. The way this is done is to get round pieces of paper so cut that there is a hole in the center, through which the string of the kite passes. The natural action of the wind pressure takes the paper along the string, and so up to the kite itself, no matter how high or how far it may have gone. In the early days of this amusement, Edgar Caswell spent hours. Hundreds of such messengers flew along the string, until soon he bethought him of writing messages on these papers so that he could make known his ideas to the kite. It may be that his brain gave way under the opportunities given by his illusion of the entity of the toy and its power of separate thought. From sending messages, he came to making direct speech to the kite, without, however, ceasing to send the runners. Doubtless, the height of the tower, seated as it was on the hilltop, the rushing of the ceaseless wind, the hypnotic effect of the lofty altitude of the speck in the sky at which he gazed, and the rushing of the paper messengers up the string till sight for them was lost in the distance, all helped to further affect his brain, undoubtedly giving way under the strain of beliefs and circumstances which were at once stimulating to the imagination, occupative of his mind, and absorbing. The next step of intellectual decline was to bring to bear on the main idea of the conscious identity of the kite all sorts of subjects which had imaginative force or tendency of their own. He had in Castro Regis a large collection of curious and interesting things formed in the past by his forebears, of similar taste to his own. There were all sorts of strange anthropological specimens, both old and new, which had been collected through various travels in strange places, ancient Egyptian relics from tombs and mummies, curios from Australia, New Zealand, and the South Seas, idols and images, from Tartar icons to ancient Egyptian, Persian, and Indian objects of worship, objects of death and torture of American Indians, and above all, a vast collection of lethal weapons of every kind and from every place. Chinese high pinders, double knives, Afghan double-edged scimitars made to cut a body in two, heavy knives from all the eastern countries, ghost daggers from Tibet, the terrible kukri of the Gurkha, and other hill tribes of India, assassins, weapons from Italy and Spain, even the knife which was formerly carried by the slave drivers of the Mississippi region. Death and pain of every kind were fully represented in that gruesome collection. That it had a fascination for Ulanga goes without saying. He was never tired of visiting the museum in the tower and spent endless hours in inspecting the exhibits, till he was thoroughly familiar with every detail of all of them. He asked permission to clean and polish and sharpen them, a favor which was readily granted. In addition to the above objects, there were many things of a kind to awaken human fear. Stuffed serpents of the most objectionable and horrid kind, giant insects from the tropics, fearsome in every detail, fishes and crustaceans covered with weird spikes, dried octopuses of great size. Other things, too, there were, not less deadly though seemingly innocuous, dried fungi, traps intended for birds, beasts, fishes, reptiles, and insects, machines which could produce pain of any kind and degree, and the only mercy of which was the power of producing speedy death. Caswell, who had never before seen any of these things, except those which he had collected himself, found a constant amusement and interest in them. He studied them, their uses, their mechanism, where there was such, and their places of origin, until he had an ample and real knowledge of all concerning them. Many were secret and intricate, but he never rested till he found out all the secrets. When once he had become interested in strange objects and the way to use them, he began to explore various likely places for similar finds. He began to inquire of his household where strange lumber was kept. Several of the men spoke of old Simon Chester as one who knew everything in and about the house. Accordingly, he sent for the old man, who came at once. He was very old, nearly 90 years of age, and very infirm. He had been born in the castle, and had served its succession of masters, present or absent, ever since. When Edgar began to question him on the subject regarding which he had sent for him, old Simon exhibited much perturbation. In fact, he became so frightened that his master, fully believing that he was concealing something, ordered him to tell at once what remained unseen, and where it was hidden away. Face to face with discovery of his secret, the old man, in a pitiable state of concern, spoke out even more fully than Mr. Caswell had expected. Indeed, sir. Everything is here in the tower that has ever been put away in my time, except... Here, he began to shake and tremble it. Except the chest which Mr. Edgar, he who was Mr. Edgar when I first took service, brought back from France after he had been with Dr. Mesmer. The trunk has been kept in my room for safety, but I shall send it down here now. What is in it? Asked Edgar sharply. That I do not know. Moreover, it is a peculiar trunk without any visible means of opening. Is there no lock? I suppose so, sir, but I do not know. There is no keyhole. Send it here, and then come to me yourself. The trunk, a heavy one with steel bands round it, but no lock or keyhole, was carried in by 2 men. Shortly afterwards, old Simon attended his master. When he came into the room, Mr. Caswell himself went and closed the door. Then he asked, "How do you open it?" "I do not know, sir." "Do you mean to say that you never opened it?" "Most certainly I say so. Your honour, how could I? It was entrusted to me with the other things by my master. To open it would have been a breach of trust." Caswell sneered. "Quite remarkable. Leave it with me. Close the door behind you. Stay. Did no one ever tell you about it? Say anything regarding it? Make any remark?" Old Simon turned pale and put his trembling hands together. "Oh, sir, I entreat you not to touch it. That trunk probably contains secrets which Dr. Mesmer told my master, told them to his ruin." "How do you mean? What ruin?" "Sir, he it was who, men said, sold his soul to the evil one. I had thought that time and the evil of it had all passed away." "That will do. Go away, but remain in your own room or within call. I may want you." The old man bowed deeply and went out trembling, but without speaking a word. Chapter 12. The chest opened. Left alone in the turret room, Edgar Caswell carefully locked the door and hung a handkerchief over the keyhole. Next, he inspected the windows and saw that they were not overlooked from any angle of the main building. Then he carefully examined the trunk, going over it with a magnifying glass. He found it intact. The steel bands were flawless. The whole trunk was compact. After sitting opposite to it for some time, and the shades of evening beginning to melt into darkness, he gave up the task and went to his bedroom. After locking the door of the turret room behind him and taking away the key, he woke in the morning at daylight and resumed his patient but unavailing study of the metal trunk. This he continued during the whole day, with the same result: humiliating disappointment, which overwrought his nerves and made his head ache. The result of the long strain was seen later in the afternoon, when he sat locked within the turret room before the still baffling trunk, distrait, listless and yet agitated, sunk in a settled gloom. As the dusk was falling, he told the steward to send him 2 men, strong ones. These he ordered to take the trunk to his bedroom. In that room he then sat on into the night, without pausing even to take any food. His mind was in a whirl, a fever of excitement. The result was that when late in the night he locked himself in his room, his brain was full of odd fancies. He was on the high road to mental disturbance. He lay down on his bed in the dark, still brooding over the mystery of the closed trunk. Gradually, he yielded to the influences of silence and darkness. After lying there quietly for some time, his mind became active again, but this time there were around him no disturbing influences. His brain was active and able to work freely and to deal with memory. 1,000 forgotten or only half-known incidents, fragments of conversations or theories long ago guessed at and long forgotten, crowded on his mind. He seemed to hear again around him the legions of whirring wings to which he had been so lately accustomed. Even to himself, he knew that that was an effort of imagination, founded on imperfect memory. but he was content that imagination should work, for out of it might come some solution of the mystery which surrounded him. And in this frame of mind, sleep made another and more successful essay. This time he enjoyed peaceful slumber, restful alike to his wearied body and his overwrought brain. In his sleep he arose, and, as if in obedience to some influence beyond and greater than himself, lifted the trunk and set it on a strong table at one side of the room, from which he had previously removed a quantity of books. To do this, he had to use an amount of strength which was, he knew, far beyond him in his normal state. As it was, it seemed easy enough. Everything yielded before his touch. Then he became conscious that somehow, how, he never could remember, the chest was open. He unlocked his door and, taking the chest on his shoulder, carried it up to the turret room, the door of which also he unlocked. Even at the time, he was amazed at his own strength, and wondered whence it had come. His mind, lost in conjecture, was too far off to realize more immediate things. He knew that the chest was enormously heavy. He seemed, in a sort of vision which lit up the absolute blackness around, to see the two sturdy servant men staggering under its great weight. He locked himself again in the turret room, and laid the open chest on a table, and in the darkness began to unpack it, laying out the contents, which were mainly of metal and glass, great pieces in strange forms, on another table. He was conscious of being still asleep, and of acting rather in obedience to some unseen and unknown command than in accordance with any reasonable plan, to be followed by results which he understood. This phase completed, he proceeded to arrange in order the component parts of some large instruments, formed mostly of glass. His fingers seemed to have acquired a new and exquisite subtlety, and even a volition of their own. Then weariness of brain came upon him. His head sank down on his breast, and little by little everything became wrapped in gloom. He awoke in the early morning in his bedroom, and looked around him, now clear-headed, in amazement. In its usual place on the strong table stood the great steel-hooped chest without lock or key, but it was now locked. He arose quietly and stole to the turret room. There, everything was as it had been on the previous evening. He looked out of the window where high in air flew, as usual, the giant kite. He unlocked the wicket gate of the turret stair and went out on the roof. Close to him was the great coil of cord on its reel. It was humming in the morning breeze, and when he touched the string, it sent a quick thrill through hand and arm. There was no sign anywhere that there had been any disturbance or displacement of anything during the night. Utterly bewildered, he sat down in his room to think. Now, for the first time, he felt that he was asleep and dreaming. Presently, he fell asleep again, and slept for a long time. He awoke hungry, and made a hearty meal. Then, towards evening, having locked himself in, he fell asleep again. When he woke, he was in darkness, and was quite at sea as to his whereabouts. He began feeling about the dark room, and was recalled to the consequences of his position by the breaking of a large piece of glass. Having obtained a light, he discovered this to be a glass wheel, part of an elaborate piece of mechanism which he must in his sleep have taken from the chest, which was now opened. He had once again opened it whilst asleep, but he had no recollection of the circumstances. Caswell came to the conclusion that there had been some sort of dual action of his mind, which might lead to some catastrophe or some discovery of his secret plans. So he resolved to forego for a while the pleasure of making discoveries regarding the chest. To this end, he applied himself to quite another matter, an investigation of the other treasures and rare objects in his collections. He went amongst them in simple, idle curiosity, his main object being to discover some strange item which he might use for experiment with the kite. He had already resolved to try some runners other than those made of paper. He had a vague idea that with such a force as the great kite straining at its leash, this might be used to lift to the altitude of the kite itself heavier articles. His first experiment with articles of little but increasing weight was eminently successful. So he added by degrees more and more weight until he found out that the lifting power of the kite was considerable. He then determined to take a step further and send to the kite some of the articles which lay in the steel-hooped chest. The last time he had opened it in sleep, it had not been shut again, and he had inserted a wedge so that he could open it at will. He made examination of the contents, but came to the conclusion that the glass objects were unsuitable. They were too light for testing weight, and they were so frail as to be dangerous to send to such a height. So he looked around for something more solid with which to experiment. His eye caught sight of an object which at once attracted him. This was a small copy of one of the ancient Egyptian gods, that of Bes, who represented the destructive power of nature. It was so bizarre and mysterious as to commend itself to his mad humor. In lifting it from the cabinet, he was struck by its great weight in proportion to its size. He made accurate examination of it by the aid of some instruments, and came to the conclusion that it was carved from a lump of lodestone. He remembered that he had read somewhere of an ancient Egyptian god cut from a similar substance, and thinking it over, he came to the conclusion that he must have read it in Sir Thomas Browne's Popular Errors, a book of the 17th century. He got the book from the library and looked out the passage. A great example we have from the observation of our learned friend, Mr. Graves, in an Egyptian idol cut out of lodestone and found among the mummies, which still retains its attraction, though probably taken out of the mine about 2,000 years ago. The strangeness of the figure, and its being so close akin to his own nature, attracted him. He made from thin wood a large circular runner, and in front of it placed the weighty god, sending it up to the flying kite along the throbbing cord. Chapter 13. Ulanga's Hallucinations. During the last few days, Lady Arabella had been getting exceedingly impatient. Her debts, always pressing, were growing to an embarrassing amount. The only hope she had of comfort in life was a good marriage. But the good marriage on which she had fixed her eye did not seem to move quickly enough. Indeed, it did not seem to move at all in the right direction. Edgar Caswell was not an ardent wooer. From the very first he seemed difficile, but he had been keeping to his own room ever since his struggle with Mimi Watford. On that occasion, Lady Arabella had shown him in an unmistakable way what her feelings were. Indeed, she had made it known to him in a more overt way than pride should allow, that she wished to help and support him. The moment when she had gone across the room to stand beside him in his mesmeric struggle had been the very limit of her voluntary action. It was quite bitter enough, she felt, that he did not come to her. But now that she had made that advance, she felt that any withdrawal on his part would, to a woman of her class, be nothing less than a flaming insult. Had she not classed herself with his nigger servant, an unreformed savage? Had she not shown her preference for him at the festival of his homecoming? Had she not? Lady Arabella was cold-blooded, and she was prepared to go through all that might be necessary of indifference and even insult to become chatelaine of Castro Regis. In the meantime, she would show no hurry. She must wait. She might, in an unostentatious way, come to him again. She knew him now, and could make a keen guess at his desires with regard to Lilla Watford. With that secret in her possession, she could bring pressure to bear on Caswell, which would make it no easy matter for him to evade her. The great difficulty was how to get near him. He was shut up within his castle, and guarded by a defensive convention which she could not pass without danger of ill repute to herself. Over this question she thought and thought for days and nights. At last she decided that the only way would be to go to him openly at Castro Regis. Her rank and position would make such a thing possible, if carefully done. She could explain matters afterwards, if necessary. Then, when they were alone, she would use her arts and her experience to make him commit himself. After all, he was only a man, with a man's dislike of difficult or awkward situations. She felt quite sufficient confidence in her own womanhood to carry her through any difficulty which might arise. From Diana's Grove she heard each day the luncheon gong from Castro Regis sound, and knew the hour when the servants would be in the back of the house. She would enter the house at that hour, and pretending that she could not make anyone hear her, would seek him in his own rooms. The tower was, she knew, away from all the usual sounds of the house, and moreover, she knew that the servants had strict orders not to interrupt him when he was in the turret chamber. She had found out, partly by the aid of an opera glass and partly by judicious questioning, that several times lately a heavy chest had been carried to and from his room, and that it rested in the room each night. She was therefore confident that he had some important work on hand which would keep him busy for long spells. Meanwhile, another member of the household at Castro Regis had schemes which he thought were working to fruition. A man in the position of a servant has plenty of opportunity of watching his betters and forming opinions regarding them. Ulanga was in his way a clever, unscrupulous rogue, and he felt that with things moving round him in this great household, there should be opportunities of self-advancement. Being unscrupulous and stealthy, and a savage, he looked to dishonest means. He saw plainly enough that Lady Arabella was making a dead set at his master, and he was watchful of the slightest sign of anything which might enhance this knowledge. Like the other men in the house, he knew of the carrying to and fro of the great chest, and had got it into his head that the care exercised in its porterage indicated that it was full of treasure. He was forever lurking around the turret rooms on the chance of making some useful discovery, but he was as cautious as he was stealthy, and took care that no one else watched him. It was thus that the Negro became aware of Lady Arabella's venture into the house, as she thought unseen. He took more care than ever, since he was watching another, that the positions were not reversed. More than ever, he kept his eyes and ears open and his mouth shut. Seeing Lady Arabella gliding up the stairs towards his master's room, he took it for granted that she was there for no good, and doubled his watching intentness and caution. Ulanga was disappointed, but he dared not exhibit any feeling lest it should betray that he was hiding. Therefore, he slunk downstairs again noiselessly and waited for a more favourable opportunity of furthering his plans. It must be borne in mind that he thought that the heavy trunk was full of valuables, and that he believed that Lady Arabella had come to try to steal it. His purpose of using for his own advantage the combination of these two ideas was seen later in the day. Ulanga secretly followed her home. He was an expert at this game, and succeeded admirably on this occasion. He watched her enter the private gate of Diana's Grove, and then taking a roundabout course and keeping out of her sight, he at last overtook her in a thick part of the grove, where no one could see the meeting. Lady Arabella was much surprised. She had not seen the Negro for several days, and had almost forgotten his existence. Ulanga would have been startled had he known and been capable of understanding the real value placed on him, his beauty, his worthiness by other persons, and compared it with the value in these matters in which he held himself. Doubtless, Ulanga had his dreams like other men. In such cases, he saw himself as a young sun god, as beautiful as the eye of dusky or even white womanhood had ever dwelt upon. He would have been filled with all noble and captivating qualities, or those regarded as such in West Africa. Women would have loved him, and would have told him so in the overt and fervid manner usual in affairs of the heart in the shadowy depths of the forest of the Gold Coast. Ulanga came close behind Lady Arabella, and in a hushed voice, suitable to the importance of his task, and in deference to the respect he had for her and the place, began to unfold the story of his love. Lady Arabella was not usually a humorous person, but no man or woman of the white race could have checked the laughter which rose spontaneously to her lips. The circumstances were too grotesque, the contrast too violent for subdued mirth. The man a debased specimen of one of the most primitive races of the earth, and of an ugliness which was simply devilish. The woman, of high degree, beautiful, accomplished. She thought that her first moment's consideration of the outrage, it was nothing less in her eyes, had given her the full material for thought, but every instant after threw new and varied lights on the affront. Her indignation was too great for passion. Only irony and satire would meet the situation. Her cold, cruel nature helped, and she did not shrink to subject this ignorant savage to the merciless firelash of her scorn. Ulanga was dimly conscious that he was being flouted, but his anger was no less keen because of the measure of his ignorance, so he gave way to it, as does a tortured beast. He ground his great teeth together, raved, stamped, and swore in barbarous tongues and with barbarous imagery. Even Lady Arabella felt that it was well she was within reach of help, or he might have offered her brutal violence, even have killed her. "Am I to understand," she said with cold disdain, so much more effective to wound than hot passion, "that you are offering me your love? Your love?" For reply, he nodded his head. The scorn of her voice, in a sort of baleful hiss, sounded, and felt like the lash of a whip. "And you dared, you, a savage, a slave, the basest thing in the world of vermin? Take care. I don't value your worthless life more than I do that of a rat or a spider. Don't let me ever see your hideous face here again, or I shall rid the earth of you." As she was speaking, she had taken out her revolver and was pointing it at him. In the immediate presence of death, his impudence forsook him, and he made a weak effort to justify himself. His speech was short, consisting of single words. To Lady Arabella it sounded mere gibberish, but it was in his own dialect and meant love, marriage, wife. From the intonation of the words, she guessed, with her woman's quick intuition, at their meaning, but she quite failed to follow when, becoming more pressing, he continued to urge his suit in a mixture of the grossest animal passion and ridiculous threats. He warned her that he knew she had tried to steal his master's treasure, and that he had caught her in the act, but if she would be his, he would share the treasure with her, and they could live in luxury in the African forests. But if she refused, he would tell his master, who would flog and torture her, and then give her to the police, who would kill her. Chapter 14. Battle Renewed. The consequences of that meeting in the dusk of Diana's Grove were acute and far-reaching, and not only to the two engaged in it. From Ulanga, this might have been expected by anyone who knew the character of the tropical African savage. To such, there are two passions that are inexhaustible and insatiable: vanity and that which they are pleased to call love. Ulanga left the grove with an absorbing hatred in his heart. His lust and greed were afire, while his vanity had been wounded to the core. Lady Arabella's icy nature was not so deeply stirred, though she was in a seething passion. More than ever, she was set upon bringing Edgar Caswell to her feet. The obstacles she had encountered, the insults she had endured, were only as fuel to the purpose of revenge which consumed her. As she sought her own rooms in Diana's Grove, she went over the whole subject again and again, always finding in the face of Lilla Watford a key to a problem which puzzled her, the problem of a way to turn Caswell's powers, his very existence, to aid her purpose. When in her boudoir, she wrote a note, taking so much trouble over it that she destroyed and rewrote till her dainty wastebasket was half full of torn sheets of notepaper. When quite satisfied, she copied out the last sheet afresh, and then carefully burned all the spoiled fragments. She put the copied note in an emblazoned envelope and directed it to Edgar Caswell at Castro Regis. This she sent off by one of her grooms. The letter ran, "Dear Mr. Caswell, I want to have a chat with you on a subject in which I believe you are interested. Will you kindly call for me one day after lunch? say at 3 or 4 o'clock, and we can walk a little way together. Only as far as Mercy Farm, where I want to see Lilla and Mimi Watford. We can take a cup of tea at the farm. Do not bring your African servant with you, as I am afraid his face frightens the girls. After all, he is not pretty, is he? I have an idea you will be pleased with your visit this time. Yours sincerely, Arabella March. At 3:30 next day, Edgar Caswell called at Diana's Grove. Lady Arabella met him on the roadway outside the gate. She wished to take the servants into her confidence as little as possible. She turned when she saw him coming and walked beside him towards Mercy Farm, keeping step with him as they walked. When they got near Mercy, she turned and looked around her, expecting to see Ulanga or some sign of him. He was, however, not visible. He had received from his master peremptory orders to keep out of sight, an order for which the Africans scored a new offence up against her. They found Lilla and Mimi at home, and seemingly glad to see them, though both the girls were surprised at the visit, coming so soon after the other. The proceedings were a repetition of the Battle of Souls of the former visit. On this occasion, however, Edgar Caswell had only the presence of Lady Arabella to support him, Ulanga being absent, but Mimi lacked the support of Adam Salton, which had been of such effective service before. This time the struggle for supremacy of will was longer and more determined. Caswell felt that if he could not achieve supremacy, he had better give up the idea, so all his pride was enlisted against Mimi. When they had been waiting for the door to be opened, Lady Arabella, believing in a sudden attack, had said to him in a low voice, which somehow carried conviction, "This time you should win. Mimi is after all only a woman. Show her no mercy. That is weakness. Fight her, beat her, trample on her, kill her if need be. She stands in your way and I hate her. Never take your eyes off her. Never mind Lilla. She is afraid of you. You are already her master. Mimi will try to make you look at her cousin. There lies defeat. Let nothing take your attention from Mimi, and you will win. If she is overcoming you, take my hand and hold it hard whilst you are looking into her eyes. If she is too strong for you, I shall interfere. I'll make a diversion, and under cover of it, you must retire unbeaten, even if not victorious. Hush, they are coming." The two girls came to the door together. Strange sounds were coming up over the brow from the west. It was the rustling and crackling of the dry reeds and rushes from the lowlands. The season had been an unusually dry one. Also, the strong east wind was helping forward enormous flocks of birds, most of them pigeons with white cowls. Not only were their wings whirring, but their cooing was plainly audible. From such a multitude of birds, the mass of sound, individually small, assumed the volume of a storm. Surprised at the influx of birds, to which they had been strangers so long, they all looked towards Castro Regis, from whose high tower the great kite had been flying as usual. But even as they looked, the cord broke, and the great kite fell headlong in a series of sweeping dives. Its own weight and the aerial force opposed to it, which caused it to rise, combined with the strong easterly breeze, had been too much for the great length of cord holding it. Somehow, the mishap to the kite gave new hope to Mimi. It was as though the side issues had been shorn away, so that the main struggle was thenceforth on simpler lines. She had a feeling in her heart, as though some religious chord had been newly touched. It may of course have been that with the renewal of the birds' voices, a fresh courage, a fresh belief in the good issue of the struggle came too. In the misery of silence from which they had all suffered for so long, any new train of thought was almost bound to be a boon. As the inrush of birds continued, their wings beating against the crackling rushes, Lady Arabella grew pale and almost fainted. "What is that?" she asked suddenly. To Mimi, born and bred in Siam, the sound was strangely like an exaggeration of the sound produced by a snake charmer. Edgar Caswell was the first to recover from the interruption of the falling kite. After a few minutes, he seemed to have quite recovered his sang-froid and was able to use his brains to the end which he had in view. Mimi, too, quickly recovered herself, but from a different cause. With her, it was a deep religious conviction that the struggle round her was of the powers of good and evil, and that good was triumphing. The very appearance of the snowy birds, with the cowls of St. Columba, heightened the impression. With this conviction strong upon her, she continued the strange battle with fresh vigour. She seemed to tower over Caswell, and he to give back before her oncoming. Once again her vigorous passes drove him to the door. He was just going out backward when Lady Arabella, who had been gazing at him with fixed eyes, caught his hand and tried to stop his movement. She was, however, unable to do any good, and so, holding hands, they passed out together. As they did so, the strange music, which had so alarmed Lady Arabella, suddenly stopped. Instinctively they all looked towards the tower of Castro Regis, and saw that the workmen had refixed the kite, which had risen again and was beginning to float out to its former station. As they were looking, the door opened, and Michael Watford came into the room. By that time all had recovered their self-possession, and there was nothing out of the common to attract his attention. As he came in, seeing inquiring looks all around him, he said, "The new influx of birds is only the annual migration of pigeons from Africa. I am told that it will soon be over." The second victory of Mimi Watford made Edgar Caswell more moody than ever. He felt thrown back on himself, and this, added to his absorbing interest in the hope of a victory of his mesmeric powers, became a deep and settled purpose of revenge. The chief object of his animosity was, of course, Mimi, whose will had overcome his, but it was obscured in greater or lesser degree by all who had opposed him. Lilla was next to Mimi in his hate. Lilla, the harmless, tender-hearted, sweet-natured girl, whose heart was so full of love for all things that in it was no room for the passions of ordinary life, whose nature resembled those doves of St. Columba, whose colour she wore, whose appearance she reflected. Adam Salton came next. After a gap, for against him Caswell had no direct animosity. He regarded him as an interference, a difficulty to be got rid of or destroyed. The young Australian had been so discreet that the most he had against him was his knowledge of what had been. Caswell did not understand him, and to such a nature as his, ignorance was a cause of alarm, of dread. Caswell resumed his habit of watching the great kite straining at its cord, varying his vigils in this way by a further examination of the mysterious treasures of his house, especially Mesmer's chest. He sat much on the roof of the tower, brooding over his thwarted passion. The vast extent of his possessions, visible to him at that altitude, might, one would have thought, have restored some of his complacency, but the very extent of his ownership, thus perpetually brought before him, created a fresh sense of grievance. How was it, he thought, that with so much at command that others wished for, he could not achieve the dearest wishes of his heart? In this state of intellectual and moral depravity, he found a solace in the renewal of his experiments with the mechanical powers of the kite. For a couple of weeks he did not see Lady Arabella, who was always on the watch for a chance of meeting him. Neither did he see the Watford girls, who studiously kept out of his way. Adam Salton simply marked time, keeping ready to deal with anything that might affect his friends. He called at the farm and heard from Mimi of the last battle of wills, but it had only one consequence. He got from Ross several more mongooses, including a second king cobra killer, which he generally carried with him in its box whenever he walked out. Mr. Caswell's experiments with the kite went on successfully. Each day he tried the lifting of greater weight, and it seemed almost as if the machine had a sentience of its own, which was increasing with the obstacles placed before it. All this time the kite hung in the sky at an enormous height. The wind was steadily from the north, so the trend of the kite was to the south. All day long, runners of increasing magnitude were sent up. These were only of paper or thin cardboard or leather or other flexible materials. The great height at which the kite hung made a great concave curve in the string, so that as the runners went up they made a flapping sound. If one laid a finger on the string, the sound answered to the flapping of the runner in a sort of hollow, intermittent murmur. Edgar Caswell, who was now wholly obsessed by the kite and all belonging to it, found a distinct resemblance between that intermittent rumble and the snake-charming music produced by the pigeons flying through the dry reeds. One day he made a discovery in Mesmer's chest, which he thought he would utilize with regard to the runners. This was a great length of wire, fine as human hair, coiled round a finely made wheel, which ran to a wondrous distance freely and as lightly. He tried this on runners and found it worked admirably. Whether the runner was alone or carried something much more weighty than itself, it worked equally well. Also, it was strong enough and light enough to draw back the runner without undue strain. He tried this a good many times successfully, but it was now growing dusk, and he found some difficulty in keeping the runner in sight. So he looked for something heavy enough to keep it still. He placed the Egyptian image of Bes on the fine wire, which crossed the wooden ledge which protected it. Then, the darkness growing, he went indoors and forgot all about it. He had a strange feeling of uneasiness that night. Not sleeplessness, for he seemed conscious of being asleep. At daylight, he rose, and as usual looked out for the kite. He did not see it in its usual position in the sky, so looked round the points of the compass. He was more than astonished when presently he saw the missing kite struggling as usual against the controlling cord. But it had gone to the further side of the tower, and now hung and strained against the wind to the north. He thought it so strange that he determined to investigate the phenomenon, and to say nothing about it in the meantime. In his many travels, Edgar Caswell had been accustomed to use the sextant, and was now an expert in the matter. By the aid of this and other instruments, he was able to fix the position of the kite and the point over which it hung. He was startled to find that exactly under it, so far as he could ascertain, was Diana's grove. He had an inclination to take Lady Arabella into his confidence in the matter, but he thought better of it and wisely refrained. For some reason which he did not try to explain to himself, he was glad of his silence when on the following morning he found on looking out that the point over which the kite then hovered was Mercy Farm. When he had verified this with his instruments, he sat before the window of the tower, looking out and thinking. This new locality was more to his liking than the other, but the why of it puzzled him all the same. He spent the rest of the day in the turret room, which he did not leave all day. It seemed to him that he was now drawn by forces which he could not control, of which, indeed, he had no knowledge, in directions which he did not understand, and which were without his own volition. In sheer helpless inability to think the problem out satisfactorily, he called up a servant and told him to tell Ulanga that he wanted to see him at once in the turret room. The answer came back that the African had not been seen since the previous evening. Caswell was now so irritable that even this small thing upset him. As he was distrait and wanted to talk to someone, he sent for Simon Chester, who came at once, breathless with hurrying and upset by the unexpected summons. Caswell bade him sit down, and when the old man was in a less uneasy frame of mind, he again asked him if he had ever seen what was in Mesmer's chest, or heard it spoken about. Chester admitted that he had once, in the time of the then Mr. Edgar, seen the chest open, which, knowing something of its history and guessing more, so upset him that he had fainted. When he recovered, the chest was closed. From that time, the then Mr. Edgar had never spoken about it again. When Caswell asked him to describe what he had seen when the chest was open, he got very agitated, and despite all his efforts to remain calm, he suddenly went off into a faint. Caswell summoned servants, who applied the usual remedies. Still the old man did not recover. after the lapse of a considerable time, the doctor, who had been summoned, made his appearance. A glance was sufficient for him to make up his mind. Still, he knelt down by the old man and made a careful examination. Then he rose to his feet and in a hushed voice said, "I grieve to say, sir, that he has passed away." Chapter 15. On the Track. Those who had seen Edgar Caswell familiarly since his arrival and had already estimated his cold-blooded nature at something of its true value were surprised that he took so to heart the death of old Chester. The fact was that not one of them had guessed correctly at his character. They thought naturally enough that the concern which he felt was that of a master for a faithful old servant of his family. They little thought that it was merely the selfish expression of his disappointment that he had thus lost the only remaining clue to an interesting piece of family history, one which was now and would be forever wrapped in mystery. Caswell knew enough about the life of his ancestor in Paris to wish to know more fully and more thoroughly all that had been. The period covered by that ancestor's life in Paris was one inviting every form of curiosity. Lady Arabella, who had her own game to play, saw in the métier of sympathetic friend a series of meetings with the man she wanted to secure. She made the first use of the opportunity the day after old Chester's death. Indeed, as soon as the news had filtered in through the back door of Diana's Grove. At that meeting, she played her part so well that even Caswell's cold nature was impressed. Ulanga was the only one who did not credit her with at least some sense of fine feeling in the matter. In emotional as in other matters, Ulanga was distinctly a utilitarian, and as he could not understand anyone feeling grief except for his own suffering, pain, or for the loss of money, he could not understand anyone simulating such an emotion except for show intended to deceive. He thought that she had come to Castro Regis again for the opportunity of stealing something, and was determined that on this occasion the chance of pressing his advantage over her should not pass. He felt, therefore, that the occasion was one for extra carefulness in the watching of all that went on. Ever since he had come to the conclusion that Lady Arabella was trying to steal the treasure chest, he suspected nearly everyone of the same design, and made it a point to watch all suspicious persons and places. As Adam was engaged on his own researches regarding Lady Arabella, it was only natural that there should be some crossing of each other's tracks. This is what did actually happen. Adam had gone for an early morning survey of the place in which he was interested, taking with him the mongoose in its box. He arrived at the gate of Diana's Grove just as Lady Arabella was preparing to set out for Castro Regis on what she considered her mission of comfort. Seeing Adam from her window going through the shadows of the trees round the gate, she thought that he must be engaged on some purpose similar to her own. So quickly making her toilet, she quietly left the house, and taking advantage of every shadow and substance which could hide her, followed him on his walk. Ulanga, the experienced tracker, followed her, but succeeded in hiding his movements better than she did. He saw that Adam had on his shoulder a mysterious box, which he took to contain something valuable. Seeing that Lady Arabella was secretly following Adam, he was confirmed in this idea. His mind, such as it was fixed on her trying to steal, and he credited her at once with making use of this new opportunity. In his walk, Adam went into the grounds of Castro Regis, and Ulanga saw her follow him with great secrecy. He feared to go closer, as now on both sides of him were enemies who might make discovery. When he realized that Lady Arabella was bound for the castle, he devoted himself to following her with singleness of purpose. He therefore missed seeing that Adam branched off the track and returned to the high road. That night, Edgar Caswell had slept badly. The tragic occurrence of the day was on his mind, and he kept waking and thinking of it. After an early breakfast, he sat at the open window, watching the kite and thinking of many things. From his room, he could see all round the neighbourhood, but the two places that interested him most were Mercy Farm and Diana's Grove. At first, the movements about those spots were of a humble kind, those that belonged to domestic service or agricultural needs, the opening of doors and windows, the sweeping and brushing, and generally the restoration of habitual order. From his high window, whose height made it a screen from the observation of others, he saw the chain of watchers move into his own grounds, and then presently break up, Adam Salton going one way, and Lady Arabella, followed by the nigger, another. Then Ulanga disappeared amongst the trees, but Caswell could see that he was still watching. Lady Arabella, after looking around her, slipped in by the open door, and he could, of course, see her no longer. Presently, however, he heard a light tap at his door. Then the door opened slowly, and he could see the flash of Lady Arabella's white dress through the opening. Chapter 16. A Visit of Sympathy. Caswell was genuinely surprised when he saw Lady Arabella, though he need not have been, after what had already occurred in the same way. The look of surprise on his face was so much greater than Lady Arabella had expected, though she thought she was prepared to meet anything that might occur, that she stood still in sheer amazement. Cold-blooded as she was and ready for all social emergencies, she was nonplussed how to go on. She was plucky, however, and began to speak at once, although she had not the slightest idea what she was going to say. "I came to offer you my very warm sympathy with the grief you have so lately experienced. My grief. I'm afraid I must be very dull, but I really do not understand." Already she felt at a disadvantage and hesitated. "I mean about the old man who died so suddenly. Your old retainer?" Caswell's face relaxed something of its puzzled concentration. "Oh, he was only a servant, and he had overstayed his 70 years by something like 20 years. He must have been 90. Still, as an old servant..." Caswell's words were not so cold as their inflection. "I never interfere with servants. He was kept on here merely because he had been so long on the premises. I suppose the steward thought it might make him unpopular if the old fellow had been dismissed." How on earth was she to proceed on such a task as hers, if this was the utmost geniality she could expect? So she at once tried another tack, this time a personal one. "I am sorry I disturbed you. I am really not unconventional, though certainly no slave to convention. Still, there are limits. It is bad enough to intrude in this way, and I do not know what you can say or think of the time selected for the intrusion." After all, Edgar Caswell was a gentleman by custom and habit, so he rose to the occasion. "I can only say, Lady Arabella, that you are always welcome at any time you may deign to honour my house with your presence." She smiled at him sweetly. "Thank you so much. You do put one at ease. My breach of convention makes me glad rather than sorry. I feel that I can open my heart to you about anything." Forthwith, she proceeded to tell him about Ulanga and his strange suspicions of her honesty. Caswell laughed and made her explain all the details. His final comment was enlightening. "Let me give you a word of advice. If you have the slightest fault to find with that infernal nigger, shoot him at sight. A swelled-headed nigger with a bee in his bonnet is one of the worst difficulties in the world to deal with. So better make a clean job of it and wipe him out at once." "But what about the law, Mr. Caswell?" "Oh, the law doesn't concern itself much about dead niggers. A few more or less do not matter. To my mind, it's rather a relief." "I'm afraid of you," was her only comment, made with a sweet smile and in a soft voice. "All right," he said. "Let us leave it at that. Anyhow, We shall be rid of one of them. I don't love niggers any more than you do, she replied, and I suppose one mustn't be too particular where that sort of cleaning up is concerned. Then she changed in voice and manner and asked genially, "And now tell me, am I forgiven?" "You are, dear lady, if there is anything to forgive." As he spoke, seeing that she had moved to go, he came to the door with her, and in the most natural way accompanied her downstairs. He passed through the hall with her and down the avenue. As he went back to the house, she smiled to herself. "Well, that is all right. I don't think the morning has been altogether thrown away." And she walked slowly back to Diana's Grove. Adam Salton followed the line of the brow and refreshed his memory as to the various localities. He got home to Lesser Hill just as Sir Nathaniel was beginning lunch. Mr. Salton had gone to Walsall to keep an early appointment, so he was all alone. When the meal was over, seeing in Adam's face that he had something to speak about, he followed into the study and shut the door. When the two men had lighted their pipes, Sir Nathaniel began. "I have remembered an interesting fact about Diana's Grove. There is, I have long understood, some strange mystery about that house. It may be of some interest, or it may be trivial, in such a tangled skein as we are trying to unravel. Please tell me all you know or suspect. To begin, then, of what sort is the mystery? Physical, mental, moral, historical, scientific, occult? Any kind of hint will help me." "Quite right. I shall try to tell you what I think, but I have not put my thoughts on the subject in sequence, so you must forgive me if due order is not observed in my narration. I suppose you have seen the house at Diana's Grove, the outside of it, but I have that in my mind's eye, and I can fit into my memory whatever you may mention. The house is very old. Probably the first house of some sort that stood there was in the time of the Romans. This was probably renewed, perhaps several times at later periods. The house stands, or rather used to stand here, when Mercia was a kingdom. I do not suppose that the basement can be later than the Norman conquest. Some years ago, when I was president of the Mercian Archaeological Society, I went all over it very carefully. This was when it was purchased by Captain March. The house had then been done up so as to be suitable for the bride. The basement is very strong, almost as strong and as heavy as if it had been intended as a fortress. There are a whole series of rooms deep underground. One of them in particular struck me. The room itself is of considerable size, but the masonry is more than massive. In the middle of the room is a sunk well, built up to floor level and evidently going deep underground. There is no windlass, nor any trace of there ever having been any, no rope, nothing. Now, we know that the Romans had wells of immense depth, from which the water was lifted by the old rag rope. That at Woodhull used to be nearly 1,000 feet. Here, then, we have simply an enormously deep well hole. The door of the room was massive and was fastened with a lock nearly a foot square. It was evidently intended for some kind of protection to someone or something, but no one in those days had ever heard of anyone having been allowed even to see the room. All this is apropos of a suggestion on my part that the well hole was a way by which the white worm, whatever it was, went and came. At that time, I would have had a search made, even excavation if necessary, at my own expense, but all suggestions were met with a prompt and explicit negative, so of course I took no further step in the matter. Then it died out of recollection, even of mine. "Do you remember, sir," asked Adam, "what was the appearance of the room where the well hole was? Was there furniture, in fact, any sort of thing in the room?" "The only thing I remember was a sort of green light, very clouded, very dim, which came up from the well. Not a fixed light, but intermittent and irregular, quite unlike anything I had ever seen." Do you remember how you got into the well room? Was there a separate door from outside? Or was there any interior room or passage which opened into it? I think there must have been some room with a way into it. I remember going up some steep steps. They must have been worn smooth by long use or something of the kind, for I could hardly keep my feet as I went up. Once I stumbled and nearly fell into the well hole. Was there anything strange about the place? Any queer smell, for instance? Queer smell? Yes, like bilge or a rank swamp. It was distinctly nauseating. When I came out, I felt as if I had just been going to be sick. I shall try back on my visit and see if I can recall any more of what I saw or felt. Then perhaps, sir, later in the day you will tell me anything you may chance to recollect. I shall be delighted, Adam. If your uncle has not returned by then, I'll join you in the study after dinner, and we can resume this interesting chat. Chapter 17. The Mystery of the Grove. That afternoon, Adam decided to do a little exploring. As he passed through the wood outside the gate of Diana's Grove, he thought he saw the African's face for an instant. So he went deeper into the undergrowth and followed along parallel to the avenue to the house. He was glad that there was no workman or servant about, for he did not care that any of Lady Arabella's people should find him wandering about her grounds. Taking advantage of the denseness of the trees, he came close to the house and skirted round it. He was repaid for his trouble, for on the far side of the house, close to where the rocky frontage of the cliff fell away, he saw Ulanga crouched behind the irregular trunk of a great oak. The man was so intent on watching someone or something that he did not guard against being himself watched. This suited Adam, for he could thus make scrutiny at will. The thick wood, though the trees were mostly of small girth, threw a heavy shadow, so that the deep declension, in front of which grew the tree behind which the African lurked, was almost in darkness. Adam drew as close as he could, and was amazed to see a patch of light on the ground before him. When he realized what it was, he was determined more than ever to follow on his quest. The nigger had a dark lantern in his hand, and was throwing the light down the steep incline. The glare showed a series of stone steps, which ended in a low-lying heavy iron door, fixed against the side of the house. All the strange things he had heard from Sir Nathaniel, and all those, little and big, which he had himself noticed, crowded into his mind in a chaotic way.